My name is Bernice Ainsworth, and I was 29 the morning my parents stood in a probate court and told a judge I was no longer capable of managing my own mind. They brought a lawyer with a gray suit and a practiced smile. They brought a medical evaluation they had paid for. My mother sat at the petitioner's table and looked at me across the aisle. She mouthed the words, "For your own good, sweetheart." She wore her Sunday coat. She had arranged her face into a perfect mask of maternal sorrow. My father sat beside her, with his hands folded resting on the desk like a man waiting for a bank teller to hand him a receipt. They expected a swift ruling. They expected the judge to look at my medical history and hand them the keys to my life. I sat at the respondent's table and did not say a word. I let the silence stretch in the room because I had learned that silence is the one thing greedy people cannot tolerate. The judge asked for my financial records to assess the estate my parents claimed they needed to protect. My lawyer handed a single folder to the court clerk. The clerk opened the file and began to read. I watched the color drop out of his face. He looked at the judge and read the document into the record. Every piece of real estate, every investment account, every liquid asset I owned had been moved to an irrevocable trust 5 weeks earlier. My mother grabbed my father's arm. Her sorrowful mask slipped, and something sharp and frantic took its place. Neither of them spoke. The lawyer closed his briefcase with a dull thud. They had mapped out my entire net worth on their kitchen table. They had already planned how they would spend the money I earned working late nights analyzing risk data. They thought a car accident had made me weak. They forgot that evaluating risk and building walls against it is exactly what I do for a living. Welcome back to Still Drama Stories, where ordinary people face quiet betrayals and walk away with the math in their favor. If you have ever been treated like a resource instead of a person, you will want to hear how this one ends. Drop a comment and tell me your age and where you are listening from, and be sure to subscribe. I am an actuary. I live in Missouri, the Show Me State. Our culture is built on a very simple premise. Do not tell me what you intend to do. Prove it with your actions. People outside my profession think actuaries just sit at desks and run spreadsheets. What we actually do is evaluate risk. We look at a complex system, we find the structural vulnerabilities, and we neutralize them before the system can collapse. I earn $120,000 a year, measuring exactly how and when things fall apart. I map out worst-case scenarios for corporations so they can survive them. I just never expected to have to apply a risk mitigation model to my own mother and father. The anomaly in my life started on a Tuesday in October. I was driving home on Interstate 70. The rain had just started slicking the accumulated oil on the pavement. A driver in a commercial delivery van merged into my lane without checking his blind spot. The impact clipped my rear bumper and spun my sedan twice across the asphalt. The airbag deployed with the force of a hammer. The seatbelt locked tight across my collarbone. The physics of a crash are just abstract numbers on a page until they happen to your own body. I woke up in a brightly lit emergency room with a severe concussion, a hairline fracture in my left wrist, and a ringing in my ears that sounded like a low, steady siren. The nurses were gentle and efficient. They dimmed the overhead lights. They told me I was incredibly fortunate to walk away with injuries that would heal in a matter of weeks. I lay in the narrow hospital bed, sorting through the thick fog in my head, trying to establish my baseline. My baseline was stability. I owned my home. I managed my life. A fractured wrist and a persistent headache were variables I could accommodate. 2 hours later, my parents arrived. Thomas and Diane Ainsworth did not run into the room. They walked in with the measured pacing of people stepping into a business negotiation. Diane wore a pressed blouse and carried her heavy leather tote bag. Thomas checked his watch before he even looked at my face. My mother did not touch my uninjured hand. She did not brush the hair back from my forehead to check my temperature. She walked straight past my bed to the plastic chair by the door where a nurse had set my personal belongings. She picked up my purse, unzipped. It took out my smartphone and slipped it deep into her own bag. "I will handle the logistics," she said to the room. "You just rest." My father did not look at my plaster cast. He stepped back into the hallway and pulled the attending physician aside. The heavy wooden door remained cracked open an inch. The ringing in my ears was loud, but I could catch the familiar cadence of his voice. He was not asking about my wrist. He was not asking about my recovery timeline or when I could start physical therapy. He asked the doctor specifically about cognitive impairment. He asked if head trauma of this nature could cause long-term confusion or affect independent decision-making. He used the tone of a man inquiring about the depreciation value of a damaged vehicle. I lay in the bed and watched the two of them operate. My brain was slow from the concussion, but my professional instincts were fully awake. A mother who secures a phone before holding her daughter's hand is establishing control of communication. A father who asks about cognitive impairment before physical recovery is assessing legal capacity, not physical health. I kept my eyes half closed. I let my breathing stay shallow and even. I gave them the silence and the perceived weakness they expected from a hurt child. An hour later, my mother sat in the corner of my hospital room while I pretended to sleep. My phone vibrated in her tote bag. She took it out, looked at the screen, and answered it. I recognized the name of my managing partner when she spoke it. Diane kept her voice hushed. She performed a mournful waver that I had heard her use at church functions when she wanted attention. She told my boss I had suffered a terrible head injury. She said it was entirely unclear when or if I would be able to return to my duties. She asked directly about the status of my short-term disability benefits. She asked where the corporate paperwork should be routed and who would be handling the payments. She did not know I was awake. She did not know I was listening to her inventory my income while I was still hooked to an intravenous line. Growing up in the Midwest teaches you to value self-reliance. You fix your own roof and you pay your own debts. I applied that mindset to my education and my career. I paid my way through university working long shifts doing data entry for insurance firms. I never asked my parents for a loan. I never asked them for a down payment on my house. I built a life that stood entirely on its own foundation. Thomas and Diane always treated my independence as a personal insult. They preferred situations they could manage and people they could direct. Looking at my mother sitting in the hospital chair holding my phone in her lap, I realized that my independence was the one thing she intended to take from me. The accident had simply provided the excuse she had been waiting for. She was going to use my concussion as a blank check. Actuaries are trained to spot deviations from the norm. A parent protecting an injured child is the baseline norm. A parent isolating a child and inquiring about their disability payouts hours after a crash is a severe deviation. The data was presenting a very clear and dangerous picture. My parents did not see a daughter surviving a car accident. They saw an opportunity opening up in front of them. They saw a high-earning asset temporarily weakened and ripe for management. I closed my eyes and let the room fade to dark. I did not confront my mother about the phone call. I did not ask my father why he cared more about my brain function than my broken bones. Confrontation without preparation is a liability. I needed to know exactly what system they were trying to build before I could tear it down to the studs. I lay in the hospital bed, let the monitors beep their steady rhythm, and started running the numbers in my head. To understand why my mother standing in a hospital room assessing my disability benefits felt like a familiar equation. You have to understand the ledger my family operated on. I live in Missouri, the show-me state. We grow up learning that words are cheap and proof is something you can hold in your hand. An actuary lives by that same rule. We do not trust optimism, we trust historical data. We want the receipts. My family, however, traded exclusively in the currency of emotional manipulation and shifting narratives. The historical data of the Ainsworth family always pointed in one direction: my older brother Landon. Landon is 32 and possesses the kind of effortless charm that makes people forgive him for arriving late and empty-handed. He smiles, and the room tilts toward him. I was the opposite. I was quiet. I was precise. I did my homework. I paid my car insurance on time. In a functional household, being the reliable daughter is a baseline. In my household, being reliable simply meant I was the safety net strung up to catch Landon whenever he fell. The math of our childhood was established early. If I won a statewide math competition, my father would give a polite nod before returning his attention to Landon, trying to secure a loan for a used car he could not afford. My achievements were treated as a given, a fixed constant that required no maintenance. Landon was the variable. He required funding, attention, and rescuing. I learned to be invisible because visibility in our house meant you were a problem causing friction. I believed for a very long time that being problem-free was how I earned their love. I thought being a reliable financial backstop was synonymous with belonging to them. You do not realize you are a resource until someone sends you the bill for it. That bill arrived exactly 2 years ago on a Sunday evening. It was the pebble that started the avalanche. My parents asked me to come over for dinner. The table was set with my mother's good plates, but the air in the room was tight. My mother had prepared a pot roast that evening. The house smelled rich and savory, but no one was eating. Landon sat staring at his plate, looking appropriately solemn. He was pushing a carrot across his plate with the tines of his fork. He had always been skilled at performing remorse. He knew exactly how to lower his chin and let his voice crack so that the listener felt an overwhelming urge to comfort him. My father cleared his throat and laid out the crisis. Landon had started a boutique fitness consulting business that had quietly and predictably folded. He had blamed a vendor who failed to deliver on time. He blamed a sudden shift in consumer trends. He blamed everyone and everything except his own refusal to look at a balance sheet. He was carrying $14,000 in credit card debt. The interest rates were predatory. The collection agencies were calling the house daily. My father looked at me with heavy, tired eyes and explained that he and my mother were going to withdraw the funds from their retirement accounts to save his credit score. They were in their 60s. A $14,000 hit to a modest retirement fund is a wound that does not heal easily. There was no demand for accountability at that table. There was only the collective family effort to shield Landon from the consequences of his own math. I sat at that table and felt the familiar weight settle on my shoulders, the urge to fix the structure before it collapsed. I did not argue. I did not lecture my brother about fiscal responsibility or profit margins. I opened my laptop right there at the dining table. I logged into my savings account, the account I built by analyzing risk models 60 hours a week. I asked Landon for the routing numbers, and I paid the debt in full. One transfer. I watched my parents' shoulders drop. The relief in the room was tangible. My father patted my hand and said, "We take care of our own." I drove back to my house that night feeling a hollow sort of pride. I thought I had finally proven my value. I thought I had secured my place as the daughter they could respect. The next morning, I was making coffee before work when my phone chimed. It was a group text from my mother to the extended family, including aunts and uncles and cousins. The message did not mention my $14,000 transfer. It did not mention the danger my parents' retirement had been in. It contained a photo of Landon smiling, looking out over a hiking trail. The caption read, "So incredibly proud of our boy today. It takes true bravery to face your financial struggles head-on and commit to a fresh start." The text message was a masterpiece of revisionist history. It erased my labor entirely. It took the financial security I had painstakingly built and assigned the moral credit to a man who had never saved a dime in his life. I stood in my kitchen and stared at the screen. True bravery. My brother had spent borrowed money on a failed vanity project, and my mother had repackaged my silent bailout as his personal moral victory. I was the invisible bank. He was the hero for allowing me to clear his ledger. That text message shattered the glass house I had been living in. I did not reply to the group thread. I did not point out the discrepancy to my aunts and uncles. I just set my phone down on the granite counter and let the cold reality wash over me. I realized that my parents did not view my independence as a point of pride. They viewed it as a pool of unmanaged capital. They saw my disciplined life, my quiet house, and my steady salary as surplus funds waiting to be allocated to their preferred investments. I was not a daughter. I was a holding company. In their eyes, my money was not truly mine. It was family money that I was merely holding in trust until the favored son required a withdrawal. That was the day I stopped expecting to be seen. That was the day I stopped seeking their approval and started protecting my perimeter. Lying in the hospital bed with the steady rhythm of the heart monitor filling the silence, I applied that historical data to the present moment. The fluorescent lights above my bed buzzed with a faint electrical hum. It sounded like a timer ticking down. My mother was sitting in the corner, flipping through a magazine she had found in the waiting room, pretending to read, while her mind clearly worked through a logistical checklist. My father was pacing the hallway outside, likely drafting the narrative he would use to explain my condition to the neighbors. I watched them through half-closed eyelids. The transactional illusion of our family dynamic was fully exposed in the harsh hospital lighting. My mother slipping my phone into her tote bag was not an act of maternal protection. My father interrogating the doctor about my cognitive function was not an expression of worry. They had spent my entire adult life trying to find a way to redirect my stability toward Landon. A fractured wrist and a head injury provided the perfect cover. In the state of Missouri, if a person is deemed incapable of managing their own affairs, the court appoints a guardian and a conservator. The conservator gains lawful control over the ward's financial assets. The bank accounts the real estate, the income stream. Everything I had built would be handed over to Thomas and Diane Ainsworth. And once they had the keys to the vault, there would be nothing stopping them from routing every dollar toward the brother who was always one bad investment away from ruin. The show me state demands practical proof. My parents knew they could not just ask me for my salary. They needed a legal mechanism to bypass my autonomy and take it. The pain in my head throbbed, a steady reminder of my physical vulnerability. But my mind was crystalline. They thought they were dealing with a frightened, injured girl who would shrink back and let them take the wheel. They were mistaking my silence for surrender. An actuary knows that you cannot negotiate with a bad risk. You can only isolate it and neutralize it. My parents had just revealed their strategy in a sterile hospital room before I was even discharged. They were going to use the machinery of caregiving to stage a hostile takeover of my life. I knew I had to get out of that bed and return to my own house. I needed to get back to the home I paid for so I could start building the firewall they would never see coming. I closed my eyes and focused on my breathing, letting them believe the concussion was keeping me docile. They thought they were managing a patient. They had no idea they were sitting in the room with a risk assessor who was already calculating the cost of their eviction. The hospital discharged me on a Thursday afternoon. The attending physician handed over a packet of recovery instructions detailing the need for rest and minimal screen time. I reached for the paperwork with my uninjured hand. Diane stepped between us and took the clipboard smoothly from the doctor. She offered a warm, reassuring smile and promised they would follow every direction to the letter. I watched her fold the documents and tuck them into her heavy leather tote bag. The transition of authority was seamless. To the medical staff, she was a devoted mother managing a crisis. To me, she was a hostile entity securing the blueprints to my life. Thomas drove my car home while Diane sat in the back seat with me. My house sits at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac in a Missouri suburb. I bought the mid-century brick ranch 3 years ago. I paid the 20% down payment in cash. I signed the 30-year fixed-rate mortgage, and then I paid it off in 5 years by living on half my income and directing every bonus toward the principal. It is a quiet, unpretentious structure. It is also the only place on earth where I make all the rules. When Thomas parked in my driveway, I expected them to walk me inside, ensure I was settled, and then drive back to their own house 40 minutes away. Instead, Thomas carried 2 large suitcases out of my trunk. They belonged to my parents. Diane unlocked my front door with the spare key I had given her for emergencies and ushered me inside. "We are staying, sweetheart," she announced. Her tone left no room for debate. "You need 24/7 observation after a head injury like that. We will not leave you to handle this alone." I stood in the entryway of the home I owned, free and clear. My wrist throbbed inside its rigid cast. A dull ache pounded behind my eyes from the concussion. The easiest response would have been to argue. I could have told them to leave. I could have pointed out that I am an adult professional capable of hiring a home health aide if necessary. But an actuary calculates the cost of friction before engaging. If I fought them, I would look erratic and defensive. A brain-injured woman throwing a tantrum against her loving caregivers. That was the exact narrative they needed to validate the hospital inquiry my father made earlier. I nodded slowly, playing the exhausted patient. I thanked them for their help. The claustrophobia set in before the sun went down. Caregiving is a noble undertaking when it is genuine. When it is weaponized, it becomes an occupation. Within 48 hours, my mother had systematically reorganized my kitchen. She moved the coffee mugs to a higher shelf I could not reach with one good hand. She replaced my organic groceries with the processed brands Landon preferred. The subtle message was clear. This space was no longer mine to control. The isolation tactics began on the 3rd morning. I sat on my living room sofa and asked Diane for my laptop so I could draft a brief email to my team lead regarding an ongoing risk model. Diane was dusting a bookshelf that did not need dusting. She did not stop her chore. "I put the computer away for safekeeping," she said brightly. "The doctor was very specific about limiting your screen exposure. We need to let that brain rest." The logic was sound on the surface. Underneath it was a calculated maneuver to sever my connection to my firm and my colleagues. Without my computer, I could not check my work email monitor, my investment portfolios, or communicate with anyone outside the walls of my own house. Then the mail stopped arriving. I am a person who tracks schedules. The postal worker always reaches my cul-de-sac by 2 in the afternoon. On the fourth day, I noticed my mother waiting on the front porch precisely at 1:45. She intercepted the carrier, took the stack of envelopes, and disappeared into the guest bedroom. When she emerged empty-handed, I asked her if anything important had arrived. She waved her hand dismissively. Just junk mail and flyers, she claimed. I knew my quarterly brokerage statements were due to arrive that week. I waited until the following afternoon when Diane was distracted by a phone call with one of her church friends. I walked into the kitchen and spotted a familiar white envelope resting near her leather tote bag. The return address belonged to my primary financial institution. I picked it up. Before I could read the summary, Diane entered the room and snatched the envelope out of my fingers. Her expression hardened for a fraction of a second before the maternal mask slid back into place. "You forgot. You told me I could manage the bills this month, sweetheart," she said softly. Her voice dripped with artificial pity. She slipped the bank statements into her tote bag and snapped the brass clasp shut. "The memory lapses are just part of the healing process. Do not stress yourself about the finances. I have it all under control." The gaslighting was executed with surgical precision. She presented a blatant lie as a symptom of my own cognitive deficit. She was actively testing my mental boundaries. If I raised my voice and accused her of theft, she would point to the outburst as proof of my instability. She would tell Thomas that the head trauma was making me paranoid. She would document the confrontation as a symptom of a deteriorating mind. I looked at the heavy leather tote bag resting on my granite counter. I did not scream. I did not fight. I offered a slow, confused nod. "You are right," I murmured. "I must have forgotten. Thank you, Mom." The satisfaction that bloomed across her face was chilling. She believed she had successfully overridden my reality. She believed her daughter, the elite risk assessor, was now a pliant asset ready for management. I turned and walked back to the sofa. I logged the interaction in my mind, holding the data point for future deployment. My father was running a different side of the operation. Thomas had spent his career selling commercial real estate, but he never quite mastered the art of closing a major deal. He had a habit of treating objects better than people. One afternoon, I woke up from a prescribed nap and heard the faint artificial click of a smartphone camera shutter. I moved down the hallway silently, my socked feet making no sound on the hardwood floor. Thomas was standing in my dining room. He was not looking at the family photos on the wall. He was crouched behind an antique cherry wood credenza I had purchased from an estate sale 2 years ago. I watched him angle his phone to photograph the original maker's mark stamped into the back panel. He stood up, typed something into his phone, and then moved to the Persian rug in the center of the room, photographing its intricate border. He was measuring the square footage of the space by walking heel to toe across the floorboards. He was taking inventory. He was running a quiet appraisal of my physical assets. A father concerned for his daughter's neurological recovery does not catalog her antique furniture. An impending liquidator does. He was already doing the math on what the contents of my home would fetch on the secondary market. He was pricing the pieces that would eventually fund whatever disastrous venture Landon had dreamed up next. I stepped back into the shadows of the hallway and returned to my bedroom. I sat on the edge of my mattress and compiled the variables. A mother severing my external communication and intercepting my financial documents. A father appraising my belongings and measuring my square footage. The overt gaslighting regarding my memory. The persistent presence in a house they did not own. The pieces snapped together into a flawless, devastating picture. I was not a patient recovering in the safety of her own home. I was a high-value prisoner under strict surveillance. They were preparing a comprehensive takeover. Understanding the threat model is the first step in neutralizing a hazard. My parents needed a confused, dependent daughter to justify their forthcoming legal actions. My competence was the greatest threat to their scheme. If I displayed sharp analytical reasoning, they would tighten their grip and accelerate their timeline. I needed to buy time to prepare a countermeasure, and the only way to purchase time was to lower their guard. I decided to give them exactly the version of Bernice Ainsworth they required. I began to perform the role of the damaged, declining ward. I started rubbing my temples frequently during conversations. I asked Thomas what day of the week it was, ensuring I sounded appropriately distressed. I let my gaze drift toward the window when Diane spoke to me, forcing her to repeat her sentences. I manufactured small, harmless mistakes like placing my coffee mug in the refrigerator or leaving the television remote in the bathroom. The performance yielded immediate dividends. Thomas and Diane relaxed into their roles as the beleaguered saviors. They stopped whispering behind closed doors. They began leaving their notepads on the kitchen island, assuming the injured girl staring blankly at the television could not process the information written on them. They spoke at a normal volume about their plans, believing my broken brain could no longer track their conversations. I sat on my sofa nursing my fractured wrist and watched the enemy operate in plain sight. I gathered the data I needed to survive. I waited for the inevitable next step in their operation, knowing that an actuary never moves until the math is certain. A week into my manufactured convalescence, my mother announced we were having company. She framed it as a casual afternoon visit to lift my spirits. A dear old friend was in the neighborhood, she claimed. That friend was Dr. Aris. I remembered him from my teenage years. He was a general practitioner who golfed with my father on Sunday mornings. 10 years ago, Thomas had helped him navigate a complex zoning issue on a commercial property he wanted to purchase for a new clinic. In my family, a favor granted is a debt that accrues interest indefinitely. My father was finally calling in the principal. Dr. Aris arrived at 2 o'clock wearing a tweed blazer and a genial, unthreatening smile. Diane bustled around my kitchen, pouring decaf coffee and setting out almond biscotti on a silver platter she had brought from her own home. Thomas sat in his usual armchair, projecting the image of a relaxed patriarch overseeing his domain. I remained on the sofa with a knitted throw draped across my lap, maintaining the sluggish posture they had come to expect. The conversation started with mundane pleasantries. Dr. Aris asked about the weather, the recent local elections, and my car accident. He offered soft, sympathetic nods when I described the crash. His voice was soothing, designed to disarm a nervous patient. But I am not a nervous patient. I evaluate risk pools. I notice when a conversation is moving along a predefined track. Actuaries spend a significant amount of time studying longevity and cognitive decline models. We build mortality tables and pricing structures for long-term care insurance products. To accurately price those products, we must understand the metrics used by the medical community to quantify mental deterioration. I knew the diagnostic tools. I knew the scoring rubrics. I knew exactly what cognitive decline looked like on paper because evaluating that specific risk was part of my job description. Dr. Aris took a sip of his coffee and casually shifted his posture, leaning forward with practiced empathy. He asked if I was experiencing any residual brain fog from the concussion. Before I could offer my rehearsed vague answer, he smiled and proposed a little game, just to see how the synapses were firing. He told me he was going to say 3 words and asked me to remember them. Face Velvet Church. I let my eyes widen slightly, performing mild confusion. I repeated the words slowly as if struggling to grasp them. Then he asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens, a standard arithmetic stress test used to measure executive function and working memory. I could have rattled off the sequence in my sleep. I calculate compound interest in my head for recreation, but a rapid, flawless recitation would shatter the illusion of my impairment. I needed to deliver a calculated failure. I started at 93. I paused for a long, credible moment staring at the coffee table. I offered 86. Then I deliberately skipped a beat and said 78 instead of 79. Dr. Aris nodded gently, his face giving nothing away. He did not correct me. He merely moved to the next phase of his hidden script. He reached into his jacket pocket, produced a blank sheet of paper and a pen, and placed them on the table in front of me. He asked me to draw a clock face and set the hands to 10 past 11. The request was the final, undeniable confirmation. This was not a friendly wellness check. This was the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. The test is a widely used screening tool for detecting cognitive impairment. It is the standard metric for establishing a baseline deficit in patients suspected of early-stage dementia or severe traumatic brain injury. I picked up the pen with my uninjured hand. I drew the circle, making the line intentionally shaky. I placed the numbers around the dial, but crowded the 12, 1, and 2 slightly together. I drew the hands, setting them correctly, but making the minute hand disproportionately long. It was an adequate performance. It showed comprehension, but hinted at a mild spatial processing error, a passing grade for basic daily life, but poor enough to warrant further monitoring. Dr. Aris retrieved the paper, studying it with a neutral expression. He asked me to recall the 3 words from earlier. I gave him face and church. I pretended to search the ceiling for the middle word. I offered blanket instead of velvet. He smiled kindly and told me I was doing just fine. Diane clapped her hands together, breaking the clinical tension. She offered Dr. Aris a refill on his coffee and guided him toward the kitchen. Thomas followed them, eager to fetch a fresh plate of biscotti. They left me alone in the living room for a span of 90 seconds. They assumed a brain-injured woman would simply sit and stare at the television screen. Dr. Aris had left his leather pad folio resting on the edge of the coffee table. The flap was folded back, exposing the documents underneath. I moved with the silent efficiency of an auditor, given unfettered access to a hostile ledger. I leaned forward and scanned the top sheet. It was not a general medical chart. It was a formal capacity evaluation questionnaire. The header bore the insignia of the Missouri probate court system. The fields required a licensed physician to attest to a patient's ability to manage finances, make medical decisions, and live independently. Dr. Aris had already filled out the preliminary sections in blue ink. He had checked the boxes indicating suspected deficits in executive function and short-term recall based on the test I had just intentionally failed. My heart rate did not elevate. My breathing remained steady. Panic is an emotion reserved for people who do not understand the mechanics of the trap they are standing in. I understood the trap perfectly. My parents were not merely gathering ammunition to control my recovery. They were manufacturing a medical paper trail to declare me legally incompetent in a court of law. A probate judge requires empirical evidence to strip a citizen of their autonomy. A sworn evaluation from a licensed physician is the heaviest weight you can place on those judicial scales. Thomas had called in his old zoning favor to buy a doctor who would ask leading questions over coffee and sign away my civil rights. The stakes clarified with crystalline precision. This was not about paying Landon's rent for a few months. This was a permanent structural takeover. If the probate court granted them guardianship, they would gain lawful, unmitigated control over my $120,000 salary. They would manage my retirement accounts. They would hold the deed to my home. I would be reduced to a ward of the state, an asset generating continuous dividends for a family that viewed me as a walking bank account. I sat back against the sofa cushions, just as the kitchen door swung open. Diane and Dr. Aris returned carrying fresh mugs. I offered them a tired, grateful smile. Dr. Aris packed up his pad folio, wishing me a restful recovery. He told Thomas they would be in touch next week to review the progress. I watched his car pull out of my driveway through the front window. The performance I had been staging was no longer just a tactic to buy time. It was the only shield I had left. They were building a legal cage around me, using my own silence as the mortar. I knew then that I could not fight a rigged medical evaluation with indignation. Indignation would only confirm their fabricated diagnosis of emotional instability. I had to fight paperwork with superior paperwork. The third layer of their scheme was now exposed. I had identified the specific legal instrument they intended to use. To defeat a probate petition, you do not need to prove you are a good daughter. You only need to prove that the assets they are trying to seize no longer exist in the jurisdiction they are attacking. I needed to shift my net worth out of their reach before their paperwork reached a judge's desk. The blueprint for my defense was beginning to take shape. I just needed to uncover their exact timeline. I needed to see the petition they were drafting. And I knew exactly where Thomas kept his most sensitive files. The house settled into a deep quiet by 2 a.m. My parents adhered to a strict schedule, retiring to the guest bedroom promptly at 10 o'clock and sleeping through the night with the heavy, even breathing of people who believe they have already won. I lay in my own bed listening to the familiar cycling of the HVAC unit and the faint hum of the refrigerator down the hall. I waited until the digital clock on my nightstand shifted to 2:15. In the business of risk assessment, patience is just as critical as data collection. Moving too soon introduces variables you cannot control. I needed the house to be entirely still before I conducted my audit. I swung my legs over the edge of the mattress and stood up. My wrist sent a dull throb up my arm, but I ignored it. I knew every inch of this mid-century brick ranch. I knew which oak floorboards yielded under pressure and which ones remained silent. I navigated the hallway without turning on a single light, letting the pale glow from the street lamps guide me toward the living room. Thomas always left his belongings in the same place. He treated other people's homes like hotel lobbies, scattering his items across shared surfaces to mark his territory. His leather briefcase rested on my dining table exactly where he had dropped it after dinner. The briefcase was a relic from his days selling commercial real estate. The corners were scuffed and the brass latches were tarnished, but he carried it everywhere because it projected authority. He used it to look like a man closing deals, even when his career consisted mostly of near misses and lost commissions. I stood beside the table and listened to the silence of the house one more time. Then I unfastened the brass latches. They opened with a soft metallic click that sounded deafening in the dark. I lifted the leather flap. Inside, the contents were meticulously organized in manila folders. I bypassed the folders labeled with household bills and insurance claims. I was looking for the architecture of their trap. I found it in a thick, unmarked file tucked into the very back compartment. I slid the file out and carried it to the kitchen counter where the moonlight filtering through the blinds provided just enough illumination to read the text. The document on top was printed on heavy bond paper. The header was formatted in the stark, unmistakable layout of a legal pleading. In the probate court of Missouri, in the matter of the guardianship and conservatorship of Bernice Ainsworth, respondent. Petition for appointment of guardian and conservator. My eyes tracked down the page, processing the legal terminology with cold efficiency. Thomas Ainsworth was listed as the petitioner. The document read less like a legal filing and more like a work of fiction. It outlined a narrative engineered to strip a human being of their civil rights. Paragraph 4 alleged that following a severe motor vehicle collision, the respondent suffered catastrophic and enduring cognitive deficits. Paragraph 5 claimed I was prone to bouts of severe confusion, unable to perform basic arithmetic, and entirely incapable of managing my substantial liquid assets. They had quantified my life and written a script to justify my legal execution. The petition detailed fabricated incidents designed to paint me as a danger to myself. It stated that I frequently left the stove unattended. It claimed I became disoriented in my own neighborhood and required constant supervision to perform basic hygiene. Every polite nod I had given them, every manufactured moment of forgetfulness I had performed over the past week, had been documented and twisted to fit this legal framework. They had not just watched me recover, they had gathered reconnaissance. The final page contained the prayer for relief. It explicitly requested that Thomas be granted full and unmitigated authority over my bank accounts, my investment portfolios, my real estate, and my medical decisions. If a judge signed this order, my signature would become worthless. My independence would be legally erased. I would become a passenger in my own life while Thomas and Diane drove my assets straight into my brother's bank account. I turned the page over to examine the exhibits attached to the back. A copy of Dr. Aris and his preliminary cognitive assessment was there alongside a printout of my home valuation from a real estate website. Then I saw the item that turned my steady pulse into a block of ice. It was a small yellow sticky note attached to the margin of the property valuation printout. The handwriting belonged to Diane. Her looping, precise cursive was unmistakable. The note contained 8 words. Landon needs the house equity by November 1st. I stared at the yellow square of paper in the dim light. The betrayal was total and absolute. They had not undertaken this elaborate scheme out of a misguided sense of parental anxiety. They had priced my assets and scheduled my financial liquidation to meet a deadline for my brother. My life, my career, the home I had paid for with years of disciplined saving and solitary labor meant nothing to them. They viewed my brick ranch as a bridge loan for Landon. He had likely accumulated another catastrophic debt, and my parents had decided that sacrificing my autonomy was a reasonable price to pay to clear his ledger. I did not weep. Tears are a biological response to sudden grief, and I was not grieving. Grief requires a sense of loss, and you cannot lose something you never truly possessed. I had never possessed their genuine love or protection. I had only ever held their conditional approval, and that approval was contingent on my utility. Now that my utility required a court order, they were simply doing the paperwork. I reached into my pocket and retrieved the burner smartphone I had purchased with cash during my walk to the pharmacy 2 days prior. I disabled the flash and muted the device. I held the phone steady above the kitchen counter and photographed every single page of the draft petition. I made sure the timestamps were active. I took a separate close-up image of the sticky note capturing my mother's handwriting next to the printed value of my home. I documented the medical questionnaire, the asset lists, and the prayer for relief. A quiet, clear focus settled over me as the digital files saved to the hidden device. My parents had made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed that building a legal case against an actuary would be a unilateral exercise. They did not realize that by drafting this petition, they had handed me their entire playbook. I now knew the exact narrative they intended to present to the judge. I knew the specific medical claims they planned to leverage. Most importantly, I knew their timeline. November 1st. It was currently the third week of September. I had roughly 5 weeks before Landon required the equity from my home. My parents would need to file the petition well before that date to secure an emergency hearing and gain control of the title. 5 weeks is an eternity if you know how to use it. 5 weeks is more than enough time to construct a financial fortress that no probate court can breach. I squared the edges of the documents, ensuring the pages were aligned exactly as I had found them. I slipped the thick file back into the unmarked folder. I walked silently across the living room and returned the folder to the rear compartment of the leather briefcase. I fastened the brass latches, listening to the soft metallic click echo in the dark. I returned to my bedroom and slid under the covers. The ceiling fan hummed its familiar rhythm. I lay in the dark, staring at the shadows playing across the ceiling. My parents were sleeping 50 feet away, dreaming of the money they were going to extract from my life. They thought the hard work was over. They thought their daughter was a compliant target waiting for the gavel to fall. I closed my eyes and began outlining the mitigation protocol. To defeat a hostile asset seizure, you do not argue with the thieves. You simply ensure the vault is empty when they arrive with the key. Tomorrow, I would need to break their perimeter. Tomorrow, I would need to find an attorney who specialized in building impenetrable walls. The deadline was set, and the risk assessment was complete. The only task remaining was execution. The morning sun hit the kitchen floorboards at exactly 7. I walked in wearing my robe, cradling my cast against my chest. Thomas was reading a golf magazine. Diane was pouring coffee. I gave them the dull, sluggish greeting they required. I told them I had a follow-up physical therapy appointment for my wrist at 10. Diane immediately reached for her car keys, offering to drive me and handle the reception desk. I had anticipated her offer. I lowered my eyes and recited a line I had practiced in the mirror. I said the doctor recommended I manage small, safe tasks on my own to help rebuild my cognitive endurance. I told her I would take a rideshare to the clinic and back. It was a calculated gamble. I was offering them a narrative of a struggling woman attempting a pathetic grasp at independence. Diane bought it. She smiled a tight, patronizing smile and praised my bravery. She liked the idea of me stumbling through a basic transaction. It reinforced her control. I ordered the car. I watched my mother wave from the porch as the driver pulled away. I waited until we were 2 miles down the interstate before I retrieved the prepaid device from the lining of my coat. I turned it on. I did not need to search for a lawyer. In the actuarial field, you learn very quickly who builds structures that hold and who builds structures that fail. Years ago, while running a risk assessment on a corporate succession plan, I encountered a legal framework so tight it essentially eliminated all liability. The architect of that framework was Sylvia Reed. She practiced out of a low-grade building in the commercial district. She was 65 years old and possessed a reputation for drafting contracts that opposing counsel simply refused to challenge. I dialed her direct line. Her assistant answered. I stated my name and my profession and requested an urgent consultation regarding a hostile asset seizure. The assistant put me on hold for 40 seconds. Sylvia picked up. I gave her the bare facts. A pending guardianship petition driven by family members targeting a 6-figure income and substantial home equity. Sylvia gave me a time, 11 o'clock. The rideshare dropped me at the physical therapy center. I checked in, completed 45 minutes of painful wrist mobility exercises, and requested a printed receipt of my attendance. Documentation is essential when your whereabouts are being monitored. I left the clinic through the rear exit and walked 4 blocks to Sylvia Reed's office. The air was crisp, carrying the dry chill of early autumn in the Midwest. I did not feel the cold. I felt the steady, rhythmic hum of a countermeasure clicking into gear. Sylvia sat at the head of a dark mahogany table. She wore a tailored navy blazer, and her silver hair was pulled back into a severe knot. She did not offer me platitudes about my injuries or sympathetic murmurs about my family situation. She offered me a glass of water and a notepad. I unlocked the prepaid phone, opened the photo gallery, and slid the device across the polished wood. I told her these were photographed at 2 in the morning from my father's briefcase. Sylvia put on her reading glasses. She scrolled through the images in silence. She read the fabricated medical claims. She studied Dr. Aris and his incomplete capacity questionnaire. She paused on the final image, the yellow sticky note detailing my brother's need for my home equity by the 1st of November. She zoomed in on the handwriting. She did not express outrage. She evaluated the data. "These are crude tactics," Sylvia said, tapping the screen. "But crude tactics often work in probate court if the respondent is caught unprepared. Your parents are banking on the presumption of care. Judges look favorably on older couples stepping in to manage a brain-injured child. If they file this motion and request an emergency hearing, the court will freeze your accounts immediately pending a full medical review." I asked her what a defensive strategy looked like. Sylvia removed her glasses and set them down. A defensive strategy is a circus. It requires you to stand in a public courtroom and prove your own sanity. We would have to hire competing medical experts to refute their doctor. Your parents would weaponize your high income, painting you as a vulnerable target, hoarding wealth you cannot safely manage. The process takes months. The legal fees deplete your reserves. And during that time, a judge might appoint a temporary conservator just to mitigate risk. I listened to the breakdown. It was a flawless assessment of exposure. Fighting them on their chosen battlefield meant accepting unacceptable odds. I told her I do not play games where the opponent controls the board. I need a mechanism that removes the board entirely. Sylvia smiled. It was a small, sharp expression of professional respect. She retrieved a legal pad and uncapped her pen. "The state of Missouri allows for proactive estate planning," she explained. "A guardianship and conservatorship petition seeks to control an individual's estate. If the individual does not possess an estate in their own name, the petition becomes structurally void. You cannot appoint a conservator to manage an empty vault." I understood her immediately. We were not going to fight the medical allegations. We were going to relocate the target. "We need to build a parallel legal structure," Sylvia continued, drawing a box on the paper. "We establish an entity that exists outside of your personal name. We transfer the deed to your house, your investment portfolios, your liquid cash, and your future income streams into this entity. We lock the door from the inside. By the time your father walks into the courthouse and asks a judge to hand over your assets, he will be asking for the keys to a house you no longer own." I asked about the timeline. I told her we had exactly 5 weeks before Landon expected his payout. I needed the structure fortified, tested, and recorded before they filed their initial paperwork. Sylvia checked her calendar. "We will have the drafts completed in 72 hours. The asset transfers will take approximately 2 weeks to clear the various financial institutions. The county recorder will need another few days for the deed. We have ample time provided you can maintain your cover at home." I assured her my cover was secure. I had spent 29 years playing the role my family assigned me. Playing the docile, recovering victim for another month required no extra effort. I asked Sylvia what specific legal instrument provided the highest level of shielding against a hostile family takeover. She wrote 2 words next to the box on her legal pad. She told me a standard revocable living trust would not suffice because a court-appointed guardian could potentially compel me to dissolve it. We needed an instrument that removed my ability to alter the terms if I was ever deemed incapacitated. We needed a contract that specifically identified my parents and legally barred them from acting as fiduciaries. We needed a financial fortress that responded only to a designated corporate trustee if an emergency arose. I looked at the notepad. The strategy was elegant. It bypassed the emotional warfare my mother craved and operated entirely within the realm of unarguable facts. It turned my risk assessment skills into a weapon of mass legal defense. I stood up and adjusted my sling. I told Sylvia to draft the documents. I walked back out into the autumn air, carrying the physical therapy receipt in my pocket, ready to return to a house that was about to become my ultimate trap. 3 days after the initial consultation, I walked back into Sylvia Reed's office. I had spent those 72 hours lying on my living room sofa, allowing my mother to bring me lukewarm soup and adjust my pillows. Diane enjoyed playing the martyr. She thrived on the optics of sacrifice. I endured her performative hovering by mentally calculating the interest yields on the accounts I was about to lock away. Sylvia sat waiting at the mahogany conference table. A thick stack of parchment grade paper rested squarely in the center of the polished wood. The architecture of my defense was finished. I took a seat and reviewed the documentation. As a risk analyst, I appreciate airtight systems. The paperwork Sylvia drafted was a masterpiece of proactive legal engineering. It was titled the Ainsworth Preservation Trust. We did not establish a standard revocable agreement. A standard framework leaves the creator vulnerable. If a probate judge ever declared me mentally unfit, my parents could petition the court to step into my shoes and rewrite the terms. They could dissolve the entity and plunder the contents. Sylvia had anticipated that structural weakness. She engineered a hybrid mechanism. The trust remained flexible while I retained my faculties, but it contained a springing irrevocability clause. The moment any medical professional or court of law questioned my cognitive capacity, the vault doors sealed shut permanently. I read the clauses detailing the transition of power. It was brilliant arithmetic. If my parents presented their fabricated medical evaluation to the court, they would trigger the exact mechanism that locked them out forever. Their own weapon would activate my ultimate shield. The second layer of defense was the appointment of the successor trustee. I did not name a relative or a trusted friend. Friends can be bullied. Relatives can be manipulated by tears and guilt trips. I appointed a localized corporate fiduciary firm based in Kansas City. These were institutional managers who operated strictly by the ledger. They did not care about my mother's dramatic sighing or my brother's fabricated emergencies. Their sole legal mandate was to protect the principal and disperse funds strictly for my personal medical care and maintenance. Sylvia also drafted a rigorous exclusionary provision into the core charter. The text explicitly barred Thomas Diane and Landon Ainsworth by name from ever accessing, directing, or benefiting from the trust assets under any circumstances. I read their names printed in crisp black ink on the heavy paper. Seeing it formalized, codified into a binding legal contract brought a profound sense of closure. The familial obligation I had carried since childhood was officially terminated. When I signed the document designating the Kansas City fiduciary, I thought about the culture of my home state. Missouri demands tangible proof. We do not accept theoretical promises. My parents had spent their entire lives offering theoretical love while demanding tangible subsidies. I was finally speaking their native language. The paperwork resting on Sylvia Reed's desk was the ultimate tangible proof of my boundaries. It was a physical barrier that no amount of crying or guilt-tripping could ever penetrate. Sylvia handed me a heavy blue fountain pen. The barrel was cool metallic brass. I gripped it with my uninjured right hand. My fractured left wrist rested in its sling, a physical reminder of the temporary vulnerability that had initiated this entire sequence. I signed my full legal name on the first signature line. I noted the time on the grandfather clock standing in the corner of the room. It was 10:14 in the morning, 5 weeks before my parents planned to execute their hostile takeover. I flipped to the next page and signed again. Page after page, I legally separated my identity from my wealth. We transferred the deed to my mid-century brick ranch first. The property I had painstakingly paid off over 5 years no longer belonged to Bernice Ainsworth, the individual. It belonged to the corporate entity. My parents thought they were living in my house. They were actually guests in a corporately owned structure. Next went the investment portfolios holding the bulk of my savings. I moved the index funds, the municipal bonds, and the high-yield savings accounts. Finally, I routed my checking accounts and future direct deposits from my actuarial firm directly into the trust infrastructure. Every dollar I earned from that moment forward bypassed my personal name and deposited straight into the fortified vault. I also took a moment to review the tax implications Sylvia had outlined. Actuaries do not ignore the secondary effects of a structural shift. The trust was designed as a disregarded entity for tax purposes, meaning my filing status remained seamless. My employer's payroll department would simply update the direct deposit routing numbers. To the outside world, nothing about my daily routine would change. I would continue to analyze risk metrics, evaluate mortality tables, and earn my salary. But beneath the surface, the entire foundation of my existence had been swapped out for reinforced steel. Sylvia processed the notarizations and stamped the seals. She assured me the county recorder would finalize the real estate transfer by Friday. The financial reallocations would clear within 10 business days. The trap was set. The bait was removed. I set the fountain pen down on the polished wood. The blue ink dried on the final addendum. The operation was complete. I walked out of the commercial district feeling an unusual lightness. I was technically penniless on paper, yet I had never been wealthier in terms of actual security. I ordered my rideshare and returned to the quiet residential street where my enemies were currently making themselves comfortable. My mother met me at the front door, her face pinched into a mask of artificial concern. She scolded me gently for taking too long at the clinic. She told me I needed to rest my fragile brain and stop exerting myself. She guided me back to the sofa and draped the knitted throw over my legs. She fluffed the cushion behind my head, acting the part of the devoted caregiver while her eyes darted toward the mail on the entryway table. I settled into the cushions and let my eyes glaze over. I performed the vacant stare of a dependent invalid. Diane returned to the kitchen and picked up her smartphone. I could hear her dialing and speaking in low, hushed tones to Thomas. They were discussing the upcoming court filing. They were refining the lies they intended to tell the judge. They were actively calculating how much equity they could extract from my property to cover the debts my brother had accumulated. I listened to their plotting and felt no anger. Anger is a volatile emotion that clouds judgment and leads to crucial errors. I only felt a cold, clinical satisfaction. They were putting unimaginable effort into a heist that was doomed to fail. They were planning to pick the lock on an empty safe. Every measurement Thomas took of my living room, every piece of mail Diane intercepted, every fabricated medical evaluation they purchased from their friendly doctor was a waste of their time and resources. They thought they were holding me captive in my own living room. They did not understand that I had just locked them inside a burning building and walked away with the only fire extinguisher. I leaned my head back and stared at the ceiling fan. The blade spun in a slow, hypnotic circle. I closed my eyes and let my breathing slow, matching the rhythm of a deep sleep. My parents continued their hushed conversation in the kitchen, their voices laced with greed and eager anticipation. They believed they held all the winning hands. They believed their favored son would soon have the capital required to fund his next disastrous venture. They were already spending the money in their minds. And speaking of the favored son, the front door handle rattled loudly the very next afternoon. Heavy boots stomped onto the hardwood floor of the entryway. The golden boy himself had decided it was time to inspect his incoming inheritance. Landon walked into the house with the confidence of a man who believed the world was built to serve him. The quiet surveillance phase of my recovery was over. The physical intrusion was about to begin. Landon did not knock. He pushed the front door open with the familiar heavy stride of a man accustomed to taking up more space than he earned. He dropped his keys on my entryway table, scratching the finished wood. He wore premium leather boots and a designer jacket, likely funded by the very credit card debt I had cleared 2 years prior. My brother always dressed like a successful entrepreneur, even when his bank accounts were empty. He whistled a low, cheerful tune as he stepped into the living room, acting as though he had just purchased the property and was conducting an initial walkthrough. I sat on the sofa with my arm resting in the sling. I did not greet him. I waited to see what sort of performance he had prepared. Landon stopped in the center of the room and placed his hands on his hips. He looked at the ceiling, then at the floorboards, then at the wall separating the kitchen from the living area. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a yellow metal measuring tape. The sharp snap of the retracting metal cut through the quiet air of the house. He walked straight past me without asking how my fractured wrist felt or if the concussion symptoms had faded. I was merely a fixture in the room to him. A piece of furniture he had not yet decided whether to keep or discard. He extended the tape measure across the width of the hallway, noting the numbers under his breath. He tapped his knuckles against the drywall, listening for the hollow sound of empty space between the studs. "Mom says this place needs better flow when I move in," he remarked casually. He did not look at me when he said it. His tone was light conversational, devoid of any guilt. The words hovered in the air, carrying a chilling weight. "When I move in, not if, not maybe." He was speaking about my home in the future tense, assuming my removal was a guaranteed outcome. I watched him unspool the yellow tape again, stretching it from the window frame to the corner of the dining nook. "That wall right there has to go." He continued, pointing toward the kitchen boundary. "It ruins the sight lines. I want an open concept layout for entertaining. If we take down the drywall and put in a steel support beam, we can fit a custom island. I read an article about maximizing square footage for resale value. You have a good footprint here, Bernice. It just needs someone with vision to unlock the potential." He was standing in the home I bought. He was discussing tearing down the walls I had painted. He was planning dinner parties in a kitchen I had paid for with years of calculated savings. The sheer unearned entitlement radiated from him. A lesser risk analyst might have stood up and demanded he leave the premises. A person driven by emotion might have pointed out that he could not afford a custom kitchen island because he could not even afford his own cellular phone bill. I did neither. I sat very still. I allowed the silence to stretch because I wanted him to keep talking. People who feel entitled usually reveal their entire strategy if you just give them enough rope. Landon retracted the measuring tape and slipped it back into his pocket. He wandered into the kitchen, opening my refrigerator and helping himself to a bottle of sparkling water. He leaned against the granite counter and shifted his focus from real estate to liquid assets. "You know, I was reading up on corporate benefits the other day," he said, unscrewing the cap. He took a long drink before continuing. "Your firm does a generous employer match, right? I think Dad mentioned your company vests their 401k contributions pretty fast. How many years do you have to work there before you keep the full match?" He was fishing for numbers. He wanted to calculate the exact yield of the retirement accounts my parents were plotting to seize. The level of intrusion was staggering. He was treating my financial portfolio like a catalog he could browse for his own amusement. I looked at his relaxed posture, his expensive jacket, his expectant smile. I felt a profound, icy detachment wash over me. It was a remarkable sensation. The anger I expected to feel simply did not materialize. Instead, I experienced the clear, cold clarity of an auditor reviewing a doomed ledger. My family did not view me as a human being. They viewed me as raw material. I was a collection of assets waiting to be harvested for their comfort. My salary, my savings, my brick ranch. To them, these were unallocated funds meant to subsidize Landon's lifestyle. This quiet moment in my living room with the yellow tape measure and the casual probing questions solidified my resolve. It was the pebble that finalized the structural shift in my mind. Any lingering trace of familial guilt evaporated. I realized that destroying their scheme was not an act of vengeance. It was a required risk mitigation protocol. I offered him a docile, confused expression. "I think the vesting schedule is 5 years," I murmured, keeping my voice soft and hesitant. "I cannot really remember right now. My head is still so foggy from the crash." I rubbed my temples, performing the exact symptom my parents had instructed their physician to document. Landon offered a sympathetic pout that did not reach his eyes. "Do not strain yourself, Bernice," he said soothingly. "You just focus on resting. We are going to take care of all the heavy lifting from now on. Dad is getting the paperwork sorted, so you do not have to worry about the stressful stuff anymore. It is going to be so much easier for you." He walked back into the living room and surveyed the space one last time. He seemed deeply satisfied with his future inheritance. I offered to get him a fresh glass of ice water. He accepted. I walked into the kitchen, retrieved a clean glass from the cabinet, and filled it from the refrigerator dispenser. The cold glass chilled my uninjured hand. I returned to the living room and handed him the water. He took a sip and smiled, thanking me. I stood there and let him enjoy his fantasy. I watched him mentally redecorate the walls. I let him imagine the steel support beams and the custom island. I felt a deep, rhythmic satisfaction knowing the truth. He was measuring an illusion. Every square inch of the drywall he had tapped, every floorboard he had walked across, and every dollar in the retirement accounts he coveted no longer belonged to the woman standing in front of him. The entire property was locked inside an entity he could never pierce. The corporate fiduciary in Kansas City held the deed, and they did not entertain open-concept renovations for entitled brothers. Landon finished his water and set the glass on a coaster. He checked his designer watch and announced he needed to meet a friend for drinks downtown. He promised to drop by again soon to check on my progress. He told me to hang in there and patted my good shoulder. The condescension was palpable, but I accepted it smoothly. I walked him to the entryway and watched him pull his vehicle out of the cul-de-sac. The taillights disappeared down the street, leaving me in the quiet sanctuary of my corporately owned home. The reconnaissance phase of their operation was concluding. Landon had inspected the prize. Diane had isolated the target. Thomas had procured the medical documentation. The variables were aligned exactly as they desired. They had spent the week building a cage they believed was inescapable. I locked the front door and returned to the kitchen to wash the glass my brother had left behind. The water ran over my fingers, washing away the last remnants of his visit. I dried my hands and looked at the calendar on the wall. Sunday was approaching. Sunday meant family dinner. My parents always chose family dinners to deliver their most significant ultimatums. They preferred a setting where the target was seated, surrounded by food, and lulled into a false sense of security. I knew the ambush was coming. I had seen the draft petition in the briefcase. The execution date was set. I walked into the dining room and ran my hand along the edge of the antique cherry wood credenza. I was ready for the weekend. I was ready for them to spring the trap they had spent so much time constructing, because I knew the jaws were going to snap shut on nothing but empty air. The aroma of roasted beef and caramelized carrots filled my kitchen on Sunday afternoon. Diane had spent 4 hours preparing the meal, utilizing my premium cookware and my spices. She orchestrated the dinner with the focused intensity of a field general staging an invasion. In the Ainsworth family, a pot roast served on a Sunday evening is never just a meal. It is a theatrical prop. Growing up, I quickly learned to recognize the culinary warning signs. If my mother ordered pizza, it meant Landon had received a poor report card, and nobody wanted to discuss it. If she prepared a delicate lemon chicken, it meant my father was expecting a commission check that might not materialize. But a heavy, slow-cooked roast was reserved exclusively for extracting major concessions. It was the exact meal she had prepared 2 years prior when they demanded I liquidate my savings to cover my brother's credit card debt. The menu was a reliable metric. The data indicated an impending assault. I took my seat at the dining table. My left wrist rested comfortably in its sling. The dull throb of the fracture had subsided significantly over the past 2 weeks, but I maintained a posture of delicate fragility. Thomas sat at the head of the table, pouring red wine into crystal glasses. He offered me a glass, knowing the discharge paperwork strictly forbade alcohol during my recovery. I declined softly, playing the obedient patient, adhering to medical advice. He smiled and took a generous sip from his own rim. The dining room was quiet, except for the clinking of silverware against porcelain. I chewed my food slowly, savoring the tender meat, while my mind ran through the procedural checklist of the upcoming week. The trust was fully funded, the deeds were recorded, the trap was primed. I only needed them to step onto the pressure plate. The meal concluded. Diane stood to clear the empty plates, but she did not carry them to the kitchen sink. She stacked them neatly to the side and sat back down, folding her hands tightly in her lap. Thomas cleared his throat. The sound was a loud, gravelly rasp that signaled the commencement of official family business. He reached down into the leather briefcase resting by his feet. The same briefcase I had audited in the dead of night. He retrieved a thick manila envelope and placed it squarely in the center of my cherry wood table. The envelope sat there heavy with manufactured legal authority. Thomas placed his hand flat on top of it and looked at me with an expression of manufactured gravity. He had perfected that look during decades of selling commercial real estate to reluctant buyers. He pushed the paper package across the smooth, polished surface. It stopped directly in front of my water glass. Diane leaned forward. Her voice shifted into a register of syrupy, thick concern. The tone was meticulously calibrated to sound soothing while delivering a lethal strike. "We need to have a very difficult conversation," she murmured. "We love you so much, Bernice. You know that. But the accident changed you. You are struggling. You are forgetting things. We cannot just sit by and watch you decline. We are stepping in to protect your assets. It is for your own good, sweetheart." The phrase hovered in the air. For your own good. It is the universal battle cry of predators attempting to disguise theft as charity. I did not flinch. I kept my gaze fixed on the manila envelope. Thomas took over the delivery, providing the logistical framework of their betrayal. He explained that they had consulted with legal counsel earlier in the week. He stated that Dr. Aris had filed a formal medical evaluation confirming severe cognitive impairment and an inability to manage independent affairs. Based on that evaluation, Thomas continued, they had filed a petition for emergency guardianship and conservatorship with the county probate court. He used a solemn, measured cadence, hoping to project the authority of a reluctant savior burdened by unfortunate necessity. "The court date is set for next month," he concluded, folding his arms across his chest. "Until then, we have filed an injunction to freeze your accounts. We cannot risk you making any confused transfers or irrational decisions with your portfolio. Your mother and I will handle all the disbursements from now on. You just need to focus on healing. I understood the psychological mechanism at play. In a standard risk model, introducing sudden catastrophic loss provokes an immediate chaotic response. They expected the shock of the legal filing to break my composure. They anticipated tears. They wanted me to scream denial. They were hoping I would panic and throw the envelope back across the table, demanding they leave my house. If I reacted with volatile indignation, they would simply point to my behavior as empirical proof of my emotional instability. They would document the outburst. They would tell the judge I was irrational, hostile, and desperately in need of their management. They had built a cage where fighting back only tightened the bars. I am an actuary. I do not react to the presence of risk. I calculate its trajectory and sidestep the impact. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I slowly lifted my right hand and picked up the linen napkin resting on my lap. I brought the cloth to my mouth and carefully wiped the corners of my lips, erasing any trace of the meal. I lowered the napkin to the table and folded it into a neat, precise square, aligning the edges perfectly. I placed the folded fabric directly beside my plate. I looked at Thomas, then I looked at Diane. I met their gaze with a flat, hollow stare devoid of any emotional currency. "I see," I said. My voice was quiet, even and entirely empty. It held the ambient temperature of a dial tone. I reached out and placed my hand on the manila envelope. I did not tear it open to read the charges. I did not scan the medical lies they had purchased from their friend. I already knew the contents. I simply slid the envelope off the table, resting it gently on my lap. "Thank you for letting me know," I added, maintaining the same chilling monotone. The silence that descended upon the dining room was dense and suffocating. It was not the silence of victory. It was the silence of a disrupted equation. My parents exchanged a swift, panicked glance. Diane shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her fingers picking at the hem of her blouse. Thomas uncrossed his arms and leaned back, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. They had prepared for a hurricane. They had braced themselves for a dramatic storm of accusations and weeping. Instead, they had collided with a reinforced concrete wall. My compliance offered them no leverage. My lack of fear offered them no validation. By refusing to fight, I starved their narrative of the oxygen it needed to survive. I did not give them a single data point they could use in court. "Is that all you have to say?" Thomas asked, his voice wavering slightly, losing its prior authoritative weight. He was trying to provoke a secondary reaction, searching for a weak spot in my armor. I offered a slow, docile nod. "I am just very tired," I murmured, dropping my gaze back to the polished wood. "I think I need to rest my head now." I stood up from the chair, carrying the unopened envelope in my uninjured hand. I did not look back at them as I walked down the hallway toward my bedroom. I left them sitting at the dining table, surrounded by the remnants of their triumphant meal. The air behind me felt heavy with their unspoken anxiety. Their scheme relied entirely on my weakness, but my total absence of panic signaled a variable they had not modeled. They were sitting in the house I owned, eating the food I bought, holding the illusion of a victory I had already dismantled. I closed my bedroom door and locked it with a soft click. I tossed the manila envelope onto my nightstand. The first phase of their assault was officially on the record. The court date was scheduled. The battlefield was chosen. My parents believed they had successfully trapped a defenseless target. They did not know I was about to spend the next several weeks gathering undeniable medical proof to spring a trap of my own. The day after the dining table ambush, I initiated the final phase of my preparation. In the insurance industry, we have a principle called burden of proof. You do not walk into a negotiation asking the opposing party to trust your narrative. You arrive holding verifiable data that renders their narrative structurally impossible. My parents had procured a flimsy one-page questionnaire from a golfing buddy to declare me incompetent. To crush that document, I needed an overwhelming avalanche of specialized medical authority. I waited for my mother to leave for the grocery store. I took my hidden phone and contacted 2 distinct medical networks located across the state line in Kansas. I needed providers totally insulated from my father's local influence. I sought out the most reputable board-certified neuropsychologists in the region. I scheduled comprehensive cognitive evaluations and requested expedited processing, paying the out-of-pocket premium fees with funds I had strategically withdrawn before finalizing my trust. When Diane returned, I mentioned that my physical therapist had recommended extended intensive sessions to prevent scar tissue formation in my wrist. I told her these appointments would take several hours. My mother practically beamed. She loved the idea of me undergoing exhausting physical exertion. She assumed the grueling appointments would leave me fatigued, compliant, and too drained to scrutinize the legal maneuvers happening around me. She handed me my coat and told me to focus entirely on my healing. My first appointment was not a casual chat over almond biscotti. It was a rigorous 4-hour examination conducted in a quiet, windowless clinic. The neuropsychologist did not ask me to draw a clock. He administered the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale and a battery of advanced executive function diagnostics. I navigated complex spatial mapping matrices. I performed delayed recall assessments involving extensive sequences of disconnected data. I solved high-level quantitative reasoning problems under strict time constraints. I answered every question with the sharp practiced clarity of a woman who calculates corporate mortality rates for a living. 2 days later, I reported to a diagnostic imaging center. I lay perfectly still inside the narrow cylindrical tunnel of a magnetic resonance imaging machine. The loud, rhythmic clatter of the magnets echoed around me, taking detailed cross-sectional pictures of my brain. I welcomed the noise. Every scan captured empirical proof that the impact of the car collision had caused zero organic damage to my neural pathways. The physical structure of my mind was pristine. By the end of the week, both specialists had finalized their reports. They did not just give me a passing grade. They drafted exhaustive 40-page documents detailing my cognitive proficiency. Both physicians swore under penalty of perjury that my mental function resided in the highest percentiles. They concluded that I possessed zero deficits in executive reasoning, memory retention, or financial comprehension. I had their statements formally notarized. The contrast between these heavy clinical dossiers and the casual checklist my parents planned to submit was the difference between a reinforced steel barricade and a paper screen. Medical documentation, however, was only the first pillar of my defense. In a probate court, financial capacity is the ultimate prize. My parents were claiming I was too disoriented to manage my own checking account. I needed to prove that their claim was not merely false, but statistically absurd. I contacted the managing partner at my actuarial firm. I did not disclose the impending family litigation. I maintained a crisp professional tone and stated I was updating my personal career portfolio. I requested certified copies of my recent performance reviews. I also asked for a redacted ledger outlining the specific corporate risk models I had successfully managed over the previous 24 months. My firm delivered a comprehensive package. The documents verified that I was the lead analyst on liability algorithms holding values in the hundreds of millions of dollars. My performance evaluations noted my flawless attention to detail, my superior analytical judgment, and my capacity to lead complex projects under intense pressure. I had been directing astronomical sums of corporate capital without a single error during the exact window of time my parents were claiming I could not function. I took a rideshare to a commercial print shop on the edge of town. I purchased a thick black binder and a set of numbered divider tabs. I stood at a rented table, smelling the sharp scent of warm toner and fresh paper. I systematically organized my defense. I placed the notarized medical affidavits in the first section. I filed the pristine brain scans in the second. I secured the actuarial performance reviews and the corporate ledgers in the third. I closed the heavy rings of the binder. It landed on the counter with a solid, satisfying thud. This object was no longer just a collection of papers. It was a concentrated, targeted weapon. I placed it inside my leather work tote and returned to the quiet cul-de-sac where my parents were currently living out their delusion. The atmosphere inside my house had shifted significantly as the court date approached. The subtle tension of their surveillance was replaced by a festive, predatory excitement. Thomas and Diane were practically vibrating with anticipation. They believed the game was already won. They treated the upcoming probate hearing not as a legal hurdle, but as a mere formality before payday. I sat on the living room sofa, resting my wrist in its sling, sipping a cup of herbal tea. I watched them pack their overnight bags. The courthouse was located in a neighboring county, and they had booked a nearby hotel to ensure they arrived early and refreshed for their performance. Diane folded her conservative navy dress, the one she wore to funerals and solemn church gatherings, intended to project the image of a burdened, grieving mother. Thomas polished his leather shoes and organized his briefcase. They did not bother to lower their voices anymore. They assumed I was too checked out to comprehend their conversations. I listened to Thomas discuss the specific general contractor Landon had selected to demolish my kitchen wall. He mentioned the contractor required a 20% deposit to order the custom quartz countertops and stainless steel appliances Landon wanted. Diane cheerfully replied that the funds would be available by the end of the week, just as soon as the judge granted them emergency conservatorship over my savings. They were spending my money before they had even set foot inside a courtroom. Their arrogance was a thick, blinding fog. They were so consumed by their own greed that they never stopped to wonder why the daughter who had independently funded her own life was sitting so quietly on the sofa. They mistook my stillness for defeat. They did not realize that a professional risk assessor never sleeps before a major audit. I took a slow sip of my tea and let the warm liquid soothe my throat. I looked at my leather tote bag resting near the entryway console table. The black binder was securely tucked inside. I was ready. The medical fortifications were in place. The financial proof was locked. The trap was fully operational. But before we could step into the sterile light of the judicial system, my parents needed to secure their social standing. They needed to control the narrative within our community. They had to ensure that when they stole my life, the neighborhood would view them as heroes doing a difficult job. I watched my mother pick up her cell phone and scroll through her contacts, preparing to broadcast her lies to the world. I finished my tea and prepared to let her dig her own grave. In the actuarial field, we understand that establishing liability often requires more than just raw data. It requires a favorable operating environment. A corporation facing a major structural failure will frequently launch a preemptive public relations initiative to shape the narrative before the regulators arrive. My mother possessed no formal business training, but she understood this principle flawlessly. As the probate court date approached, the sixth layer of their operation materialized. Thomas had secured the fabricated medical paperwork, and Landon had planned the spending, but Diane was in charge of the social assassination. In a Missouri suburb, legal actions do not exist in a void. They require community consensus. My parents knew that stealing a daughter's autonomy is a distasteful process that tends to raise eyebrows among neighbors and church congregations. To mitigate that specific social risk, Diane needed to transform their upcoming theft into an act of tragic parental sacrifice. She needed the neighborhood to look at me and see a broken, unmanageable burden. Diane weaponized the local prayer chain. I grew up attending Sunday services with my parents, and I learned very early that suburban prayer requests are rarely about seeking divine intervention. They are highly efficient delivery systems for targeted gossip. Diane began making prolonged phone calls from my kitchen island while I sat a few feet away on the sofa. She spoke in hushed, tremulous tones, ensuring her voice carried just enough for me to hear the performance. She called the head of the neighborhood association. She called the women who organized the community bake sales. I listened as she painted a picture of my rapid mental decline. She told a woman named Brenda that I had forgotten how to operate my own microwave and nearly started a kitchen fire. She told the church secretary that I frequently wandered my own hallway in a state of deep confusion, unable to recognize my surroundings. She sighed heavily into the receiver, claiming she and Thomas were exhausted but resolute in their duty to care for their impaired child. Every phone call laid another brick in the false foundation they were building. The true test of her campaign occurred 3 days before the scheduled hearing. I stepped out onto my front porch to retrieve a package left by a delivery driver. The autumn air was sharp and clear. I bent down to pick up the cardboard box, using my right hand to support the weight. From across the manicured lawn, my next-door neighbor, Mrs. Higgins, approached. She was a retired schoolteacher who took great pride in maintaining the pristine condition of our cul-de-sac. We usually exchanged polite waves and brief conversations about landscaping. Today, her demeanor was drastically different. Mrs. Higgins did not smile. She walked up my driveway with her hands clasped tightly together, projecting a heavy, suffocating pity. Her eyes scanned my face, searching for the vacant stare my mother had promised her. "Your mother told me you were having a particularly difficult week." "Bernice?" she said, her voice pitched low and slow, as if she were addressing a frightened toddler. "She said you are struggling with basic tasks since the collision. I want you to know my husband is happy to bring his mower over and maintain your grass. You should not be out here trying to lift things. Let me carry that box inside for you." I stood on my porch holding the small package. The urge to correct the record was a sharp instinct. A normal person accused of losing their mind wants to immediately demonstrate their lucidity. They want to list their accomplishments, recite the days of the week, and demand to know exactly what lies are being spread about them. But I do not operate on normal instincts. I operate on risk calculations. If I raised my voice and defended my intellect, Mrs. Higgins would view my agitation as proof of the very instability Diane had described. In the theater of cognitive decline, any passionate defense is interpreted as erratic denial. The most dangerous thing a falsely accused person can do is attempt to argue with the audience. I maintained a serene, relaxed posture. I offered Mrs. Higgins a gentle, appreciative smile. "I am managing just fine, but I genuinely appreciate your thoughtfulness," I replied, keeping my cadence steady and measured. "My wrist is healing well, and I am enjoying the fresh air. Please tell your husband, thank you for the generous offer." Mrs. Higgins hesitated. She scrutinized my calm demeanor, trying to reconcile the articulate woman standing in front of her with the tragic figure Diane had constructed over the telephone. The cognitive dissonance was visible on her face. However, a well-planted rumor is incredibly difficult to uproot. She nodded slowly, still clinging to her pity. "You just rest," she murmured, backing down the driveway. "Your parents are saints for stepping in to handle your affairs. You are so lucky to have them." I turned and walked back into my house carrying the box. I locked the front door. The physical isolation of my recovery was now compounded by a profound social quarantine. My parents were systematically burning the bridges that connected me to my own community. They wanted me marooned on an island of their own design where their version of reality was the only one that mattered. The emotional toll of this tactic was substantial. It is one thing to know your family covets your financial portfolio. It is an entirely different experience to sit silently while they strip you of your dignity in front of the people you see every day. I felt the sting of their betrayal settling deep into my chest. They were stealing my reputation to legitimize the theft of my livelihood. I walked into the kitchen and poured a glass of cold water. Diane was sitting at the island typing a text message into her smartphone. She looked up and offered a bright, artificial smile, asking if the brief walk outside had tired me out. I took a slow drink from my glass and observed the woman who had brought me into the world. She was so confident in her strategy. She truly believed that suburban gossip held the same weight as empirical truth. I embraced the isolation. I let the sting fade, replaced by the familiar cold logic of my profession. In the court of public opinion, hearsay is a powerful currency. But I was not preparing for the court of public opinion. I was preparing for a court of law. In a judicial setting, rumors evaporate upon contact with hard documented facts. A judge does not rule based on what the neighborhood prayer chain discussed on a Tuesday morning. A judge rules based on sworn affidavits, certified medical records, and notarized trust documents. I realized that allowing my mother to build her pedestal of lies was actually a strategic advantage. The higher she elevated her false narrative, the more devastating her public humiliation would be when the structure collapsed. She was drawing everyone's attention to the stage, ensuring that her eventual failure would be witnessed by the very people she was trying to manipulate. She was amplifying her own defeat. The final days leading up to the hearing passed in a tense, quiet rhythm. The smear campaign had saturated the neighborhood. I received sympathetic glances from the mail carrier. A church elder dropped off a casserole with a note offering prayers for my troubled mind. I accepted every token of pity with a blank, polite face. I filed the casseroles in the refrigerator, and I filed the interactions in my memory. On the evening before the scheduled probate hearing, the atmosphere in my house reached a fever pitch of predatory anticipation. Thomas had polished his best suit and laid it out on the guest bed. He spent an hour reviewing his notes, practicing the solemn speech he intended to deliver to the judge. Diane ironed her conservative dress, her face flushed with the thrill of impending victory. She hummed a cheerful hymn while she packed her overnight bag. They retired to their room early, wanting to be well rested for their triumph. I remained in the living room listening to the quiet settling of the house. The trap was fully primed. My parents had procured the medical lies secured, the legal counsel mapped out my assets, and convinced the community that I was a broken vessel requiring their management. They had accounted for every variable except one. I stood up and walked to the entryway console. I opened my leather work tote and ran my fingers along the smooth spine of the black binder resting inside. The medical affidavits, the actuarial ledgers, and the trust confirmations were sitting quietly in the dark, waiting for their moment in the light. The social assassination was complete, but the trial was scheduled for the morning. I turned off the living room lamp and walked down the hallway ready to travel to the courthouse and show my family exactly how an actuary closes a fraudulent account. The morning of the hearing arrived with a biting chill that stripped the final autumn leaves from the trees lining my quiet cul-de-sac. I woke early and dressed with deliberate care. I selected a tailored charcoal blazer and dark slacks, choosing garments that projected competence rather than fragility. I left my wrist sling on the kitchen counter. The bone was sufficiently healed, and I no longer needed to perform the role of the broken invalid. I placed my heavy leather work tote on the passenger seat of my sedan and drove toward the county center. The sky was a pale, bruised gray, offering flat, unyielding light. It was the perfect weather for balancing a ledger. The Missouri Probate Courthouse is an imposing structure built from heavy limestone and granite. It was designed to make the individual citizen feel small and insignificant against the weight of the state. I walked through the metal detectors and navigated the echoing corridors. The building smelled of floor wax, old paper, and polished mahogany. It is a distinct scent, unique to places where human lives are dismantled and reassembled through legal decrees. The hallways were lined with wooden benches, occupied by nervous families whispering in hushed tones. I approached the corridor leading to courtroom 4 and spotted my family from a distance. They stood in a tight, unified cluster, radiating an aura of practiced grief. Thomas wore his best dark suit, the one he utilized to secure commercial loans during his prime earning years. He stood with his shoulders squared, projecting the image of a burdened but resolute patriarch. Diane wore a somber navy dress that fell past her knees. She held a tissue in her right hand, occasionally dabbing at her dry eyes to signal her maternal suffering to anyone walking past. They had dressed for a funeral because they believed they were about to bury my autonomy. Beside them stood the legal counsel they had procured for the occasion. He was a flashy, expensive litigator wearing a custom pinstripe suit and a silk tie that caught the fluorescent lighting. He held a remarkably thin leather folder. He exuded the relaxed, arrogant posture of a man expecting a routine rubber stamp proceeding. He smiled and chatted amiably with Thomas, treating the impending destruction of my civil rights as a casual morning errand. My parents had likely hired him using funds borrowed against the anticipated equity of my estate. He did not look like a lawyer preparing for a grueling battle. He looked like a man waiting for a barista to hand him a coffee. A few feet away from the legal consultation stood Landon. He leaned against the cool marble wall, bathed in the blue glow of his smartphone screen. His thumbs moved rapidly across the glass. I watched him swipe through images and could easily guess the inventory he was browsing. He was likely pricing stainless steel kitchen appliances or high-end living room fixtures for the renovation he planned to execute in my home. He had never navigated a courtroom in his life unless it involved a traffic citation I had paid to expunge on his behalf. His presence in this hallway was the ultimate insult. He was standing outside the slaughterhouse waiting for his specific cut of the meat. I continued down the corridor, my footsteps echoing against the stone floor. I carried nothing but my leather tote. I was not flanked by a legal team. I did not project fear or anxiety. Diane spotted my approach first. She broke away from the group and stepped directly into my path, blocking my forward momentum. She reached out and placed a hand lightly on my shoulder. Her touch was purely performative, intended for the benefit of the passing bailiffs and court clerks. "We will get you the help you need today, sweetheart," she whispered. Her breath smelled of peppermint and stale coffee. Her eyes were bright with the eager thrill of the impending theft. She searched my face for signs of panic or disorientation. I did not flinch. I did not brush her hand away. I offered a slow, shallow nod. It was the nod of a resigned, defeated victim. It was the exact response she required to sustain her delusion for 5 more minutes. She smiled a tight, patronizing curve of her lips and stepped aside, allowing me to pass. Thomas avoided my gaze entirely, busying himself by discussing a golf handicap with the flashy lawyer. Landon did not even look up from his screen. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and entered the courtroom. The gallery was mostly empty, save for a few individuals waiting for subsequent docket numbers. The space was grand and intimidating. The judge, elevated on a carved wooden bench, sat flanked by the state and national flags. The respondent table was positioned on the left. The petitioner table was on the right. I walked to the left and pulled out a heavy wooden chair. I sat down, placing my leather tote on the floor beside my feet. The heavy doors swung open a moment later. My parents entered, followed by their litigator and my brother. They claimed the petitioner table spreading out like an occupying force. The lawyer unpacked his slim file, arranging 3 crisp pieces of paper and a gold pen on the polished wood. Diane took the seat next to him, smoothing her skirt and adopting a posture of pious sorrow. Landon sat in the front row of the gallery directly behind them, crossing his legs and finally sliding his phone into his jacket pocket. I sat across the aisle and observed the people who shared my genetic code. Society dictates a biological loyalty, a mandatory affection bound by blood and shared history. But blood is merely a biological fluid. It does not forge trust, and it does not generate integrity. My family viewed me not as a daughter or a sister, but as a ledger entry. I was a column of valuable assets waiting to be transferred to the debit side of my brother's endless deficit. In a different life, under different circumstances, I might have felt a crushing wave of despair. I might have mourned the parents I deserved, but never received. Today, sitting in the quiet echo of the courtroom, I felt no grief. I felt no anger. Anger is a volatile, inefficient emotion that clouds judgment and prompts unforced errors. I felt only the steady, rhythmic anticipation of a mathematician who has completed a complex equation and is simply waiting to press the equal sign. The rear doors of the courtroom opened one final time. Sylvia Reed walked down the center aisle. She did not strut. She glided forward with the predatory grace of an apex legal predator. She wore a slate gray suit and carried a thick, reinforced briefcase. She bypassed the gallery and took the seat directly beside me at the respondent table. She did not nod or acknowledge the opposing counsel. She unlatched her briefcase and extracted a single pristine file folder. The flashy litigator at the petitioner table glanced over. He recognized Sylvia instantly. I watched his confident posture falter for a fraction of a second. His smile tightened. He leaned over and whispered something urgent to Thomas. Thomas looked across the aisle, his brow furrowing in a sudden, unexpected spike of confusion. They had anticipated a public defender or a confused, vulnerable respondent representing herself. They had not anticipated the most lethal estate attorney in the county sitting quietly by my side. The bailiff stepped forward and announced the arrival of Judge Harrison. We all stood in unison. The judge took the bench, arranging his black robes and opening the thick docket ledger. The air in the courtroom shifted from relaxed anticipation to formal procedural gravity. My parents straightened their spines. Diane resumed her sorrowful mask. Thomas gripped the edge of the table. The final phase of the operation was commencing. The trap lay open under the bright fluorescent lights of the judicial system. I reached down into my leather tote and wrapped my fingers around the spine of the black binder, ready for the gavel to fall. Judge Caldwell called the docket. His voice carried the dull, flat resonance of a man who had presided over thousands of familial disputes. He adjusted his reading glasses and opened the heavy file resting on his elevated bench. The air in the courtroom grew tight. The bailiff recited the case number and the names of the involved parties echoing against the wood-paneled walls. Thomas and Diane sat rigidly at the petitioner table. Their litigator stood up, smoothing the lapels of his custom pinstripe suit. He stepped out from behind the desk, claiming the center of the floor, with the practiced ease of a stage actor finding his light. The lawyer began his opening statement. He did not lead with facts. He led with narrative. He paced slowly back and forth, painting a portrait of a devastating tragedy. He described my car collision as a catastrophic event that had stolen my vitality. He utilized a soft, mournful cadence to suggest that the brilliant daughter my parents once knew had been replaced by a confused, vulnerable shadow. He explicitly used the word hoarding, suggesting that my reluctance to surrender my finances was a symptom of a diseased mind clinging to resources it could no longer comprehend. He told the court that I was endangering my own future through stubborn irrationality. To anchor his fiction, he produced the single sheet of paper Dr. Aris had filled out during his social visit to my living room. The lawyer waved the flimsy questionnaire in the air, treating it as a sacred medical decree. He cited the missed numbers in my backward countdown and the disproportionate hands on the clock face I had drawn. He argued that these minor errors were undeniable indicators of early-onset cognitive failure. He urged the judge to act swiftly to prevent me from ruining the estate I had spent my 20s building. Diane and Thomas executed their supporting roles flawlessly. While their counsel spoke, Diane pressed a folded tissue to the corners of her eyes. She let out a single stifled sob, timing it perfectly to punctuate the lawyer's assertion of my vulnerability. Thomas reached over and placed a comforting hand over hers, projecting the stoic endurance of a father bearing an unimaginable burden. They conveyed a deep sacrificial love. They were performing the exact suburban tragedy they had rehearsed in their kitchen and broadcasted to the neighborhood. Judge Caldwell absorbed the performance. He nodded slowly, making a few notes on his legal pad. He was accustomed to these tragic petitions. He turned his gaze toward the respondent table, preparing to address the broken woman the petitioners had just described. He expected a frightened defensive ward. He expected me to interrupt or weep or display the very erratic behavior the lawyer had just outlined. I remained entirely motionless. I kept my hands folded on my lap and met the judge's eyes with steady, unblinking clarity. I offered no reaction to the lies. Sylvia Reed stood up. She did not pace. She did not alter the pitch of her voice to convey emotion. She simply picked up the heavy black binder I had compiled and approached the bench. Your Honor, my client does not dispute that a motor vehicle collision occurred. Sylvia began, her tone crisp and factual. We do, however, dispute every single medical and financial assertion presented by the petitioners. The document opposing counsel just referenced is a preliminary screening tool administered during a social visit by a general practitioner with close personal ties to the petitioners. It is not a diagnostic conclusion. Sylvia opened the binder and extracted the first set of documents. She handed the heavy stacks of paper to the court clerk. We submit into evidence Exhibits A and B. Sylvia continued. These are comprehensive sworn neuropsychological evaluations conducted less than 10 days ago by 2 independent board-certified specialists in the state of Kansas. The assessments consist of rigorous executive function diagnostics, spatial mapping matrices, and magnetic resonance imaging. The flashy litigator stopped smiling. He took a step back toward his table, his eyes darting toward the thick files the clerk was handing up to the bench. Judge Caldwell adjusted his glasses and began to read the specialist's conclusions. The silence in the courtroom stretched thin and taut. Sylvia let the judge review the undeniable data before she resumed speaking. Both physicians swear under penalty of perjury that my client possesses 0 cognitive deficits. Her neural pathways are pristine. Her executive reasoning resides in the upper percentiles. The claim that she is mentally impaired is an empirical falsehood. Thomas shifted his weight in his chair. The stoic patriarch facade began to crack. Diane lowered her tissue, her eyes widening as she watched the judge flip through pages of advanced medical data that crushed their friendly neighborhood evaluation. Sylvia did not give them a moment to recover. She reached back into the binder and pulled out the next set of tabs. She did not merely want to prove I was sane. She wanted to prove I was exceptional. Furthermore, Your Honor, the petitioners claim my client is incapable of managing a personal checking account, Sylvia stated, handing the next stack of documents to the clerk. We submit Exhibit C. These are certified employment ledgers and performance reviews from my client's actuarial firm. They verify that over the exact period the petitioners allege she was incapacitated, my client was serving as the lead analyst on corporate risk models, managing liability algorithms valued in the hundreds of millions of dollars. She executed these duties flawlessly. The contrast was stark and devastating. The narrative of a tragic brain-injured victim evaporated into the stale air of the courtroom. The judge looked at the employment ledgers and then looked down at the petitioner table with a narrowing gaze. He recognized the discrepancy between the story he had been told and the hard data sitting in front of him. The opposing lawyer realized his primary line of attack had been obliterated. His medical foundation was gone. He needed to pivot immediately to salvage the expensive fee he had charged my parents. He scrambled back to his desk and grabbed his legal pad, adopting a posture of urgent concern. Your Honor, we must look at the holistic risk, the lawyer argued, his voice rising in volume to compensate for his lack of evidence. Regardless of these recent out-of-state evaluations, traumatic brain injuries are highly unpredictable. Symptoms can remain dormant and manifest suddenly. We are talking about a young woman in possession of substantial liquid assets and unencumbered real estate. We cannot gamble her future on a snapshot of temporary clarity. The petitioners are requesting this conservatorship precisely to protect those significant financial holdings before a delayed cognitive episode leaves her destitute. He was clinging to the money. When the medical excuse failed, the raw financial motive floated to the surface. He was demanding that the court preemptively seize my property based on a hypothetical future risk. He used the phrases substantial liquid assets and unencumbered real estate multiple times, attempting to remind the judge of the high stakes involved. Judge Caldwell raised a hand, cutting off the lawyer's desperate pivot. The judge was a man who required orderly ledgers before making sweeping structural decisions. The entire petition hinged on the premise that a vast, vulnerable estate needed an immediate guardian, counsel the judge said, addressing both tables. If the core of this petition centers on the management and protection of the respondent's estate, I need to understand the exact scope of the liability we are discussing. Before I rule on the validity of these competing medical claims or consider any preemptive conservatorship, I require clarity on the underlying capital. The judge picked up his pen and pointed it toward Sylvia. He demanded a full accounting of my financial records. He ordered the court to review the specific real estate deeds, the investment portfolio balances, and the liquid cash accounts the petitioners were trying to control. My parents let out a collective breath. Diane nodded vigorously, her face flushing with renewed hope. Thomas leaned back and offered a tight, satisfied smirk to his lawyer. They believed the judge was finally asking for the menu. They thought the court was preparing to inventory the vault so the keys could be handed over to them. They were eager to hear my net worth read into the public record. I sat at the respondent table and watched their premature triumph. I felt the familiar, cool precision of an actuary finalizing a risk report. The variables had aligned perfectly. They had pushed the court to demand the financial data. They had stepped directly onto the pressure plate. I looked at Sylvia. She closed the black binder and picked up the final slim file folder resting at the bottom of her briefcase, ready to deliver the final calculation. Sylvia Reed did not rush her delivery. She approached the bench with the calm certainty of a seasoned auditor presenting a final, irrefutable ledger. The courtroom held its collective breath. My parents leaned forward in their heavy wooden chairs, hungry for the financial disclosure they believed would seal their victory. Thomas was practically vibrating with anticipation, likely calculating the down payment required for the contractor Landon had hired to destroy my kitchen. Your Honor, the petitioners have requested a full accounting of the respondent's financial records, Sylvia said, her voice carrying clearly through the quiet chamber. We are more than prepared to provide the court with the exact current valuation and location of my client's personal estate. She handed a sealed manila envelope to the court clerk. The clerk was a veteran official accustomed to handling bitter, multi-million-dollar probate disputes and forged wills. He took the envelope, broke the formal seal, and extracted the certified pages. I watched the clerk's eyes scan the top paragraph of the primary document. The standard bureaucratic indifference vanished from his features. The color drained from his face, leaving a pale, rigid astonishment in its wake. He looked at Sylvia, then cast a stunned glance toward the petitioner's table, realizing the sheer magnitude of the legal miscalculations sitting in the room. He handed the thick document up to Judge Caldwell. What you are reviewing, Your Honor, is not a bank statement, Sylvia announced, turning slightly so her voice resonated toward the gallery. It is a certified deed of transfer and the founding charter of a corporate entity. Judge Caldwell adjusted his reading glasses. He read the first page, his brow furrowing as he processed the sophisticated legal architecture laid out before him. The petitioners have filed this lawsuit under the premise that they must protect the respondents' substantial liquid assets and unencumbered real estate. Sylvia continued mirroring the opposing counsel's previous terminology to devastating effect. There is only one structural flaw in their entire argument. Bernice Ainsworth does not possess a personal estate. The flashy litigator shot up from his chair, his custom suit shifting as he pointed a finger toward our table. Objection, Your Honor. The respondent owns a mid-century property in an exclusive suburb and maintains highly lucrative investment portfolios. We have the property tax records sitting right here on our desk. You have historical records, Sylvia countered smoothly, not raising her voice by a single decibel. Exactly 5 weeks ago, my client executed a comprehensive legal transfer. 100% of her real property, her investment portfolios, her savings, and her future income streams were formally relocated into the Ainsworth Preservation Trust. Thomas froze. His hand, which had been resting confidently on the polished wood, clamped down so hard his knuckles turned white. This trust is managed exclusively by an independent corporate fiduciary firm located in Kansas City, Sylvia explained, detailing the framework with surgical precision. My client is the sole beneficiary. Furthermore, the charter contains a specific springing irrevocability clause. The moment any party questions my client's cognitive capacity or attempts to install a conservator, the trust locks permanently. The corporate trustee assumes unmitigated control. Institutional managers do not respond to familial demands. They govern strictly by the ledger, even if my client were incapacitated, which she empirically is not. Her parents have zero legal standing to access a single cent, Sylvia stated, delivering the final definitive blow. In fact, Section 4 of the Charter explicitly bars Thomas Diane and Landon Ainsworth by name from ever acting as fiduciaries, beneficiaries, or managers of this trust under any circumstance. Diane grabbed her husband's arm. Her manicured fingernails dug fiercely into the dark fabric of his suit sleeve. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged. She resembled a creature pulled abruptly from the deep ocean, suffocating in an atmosphere she could no longer manipulate. In the gallery behind them, a sharp clattering noise shattered the silence. Landon had dropped his smartphone. The device hit the hardwood floor and skidded under the wooden pew. He did not bend down to retrieve it. He simply stared at the back of my head, processing the catastrophic reality. The custom kitchen island, the open-concept renovations, and the subsidized lifestyle he had planned were evaporating into dust. The vendor deposits he had promised the contractor were about to default squarely onto his own empty bank accounts. Thomas had spent decades in commercial real estate. He understood contracts intimately. He understood that a corporate fiduciary operating under an irrevocable trust was a titanium fortress. A local probate judge could not compel a Kansas City institutional manager to disperse funds to a ward's parents. The money was walled off. The house was untouchable. The entire premise of their lawsuit had just been structurally deleted. The litigator stood frozen, his mouth slightly ajar. He looked down at Thomas, realizing his clients had not disclosed this possibility because they had been entirely ignorant of it. They had paid him thousands of dollars in non-refundable retainers to seize a vault their daughter had quietly emptied a month prior. He could not argue against a properly executed trust in a simple guardianship hearing. There was no legal avenue left to pursue. Judge Caldwell lowered the document. He looked at the petitioner table. The irritation radiating from the bench was palpable. A judge does not appreciate having his courtroom utilized for an attempted family heist. He looked at the flimsy medical evaluation Dr. Aris had provided, then at the pristine brain scans and 40-page neuropsychological affidavits Sylvia had submitted. Finally, he looked at the trust charter, expressly barring the petitioners from the assets they claimed they desperately wanted to protect. Counsel, Judge Caldwell said, addressing the opposing lawyer with a tone colder than a Missouri winter. You brought an emergency guardianship petition into my court, claiming the respondent was a vulnerable, confused individual, incapable of managing her own life. Yet the empirical evidence before me demonstrates that she possessed the foresight, the intellect, and the precise legal acumen to engineer a highly sophisticated asset protection strategy 5 weeks before you even filed your paperwork. The lawyer tried to salvage his professional dignity. Your Honor, we were unaware of this trust arrangement. Ignorance is not a valid legal strategy, the judge interrupted sharply. The respondent is clearly operating at an exceptional cognitive level. The medical documentation is irrefutable. The financial documentation renders your request for a conservatorship entirely moot. There is no estate for this court to place under your client's protection. The trust is impenetrable. Diane began to hyperventilate softly, taking short, shallow breaths. The neighborhood sympathy, the casseroles, the hushed phone calls on the prayer chain. She had built an extensive social pedestal based on her tragic sacrifice. Now the court was formally recognizing her as a predator who had been flawlessly outsmarted by her own prey. She would have to return to her cul-de-sac and explain why the judge had thrown her out of the room. Furthermore, Judge Caldwell continued, his voice echoing with stern finality. The timeline of these events, coupled with the glaring inadequacy of the initial medical screening provided by the petitioners, suggests a profound lack of good faith. Attempting to strip a competent adult of her civil liberties to gain control of her finances is an egregious abuse of the probate system. Thomas stared straight ahead. The patriarchal authority he had worn like a tailored suit was stripped away, leaving an aging, outmaneuvered man staring at a legal defeat he could not charm his way out of. He had bet his reputation and his remaining cash reserves on this ambush, and he had lost everything. This petition is dismissed with prejudice. Judge Caldwell declared, lifting his wooden gavel. The phrase with prejudice meant they could never file this exact claim against me again. He struck the gavel against the sounding block. The sharp crack echoed through the chamber, sealing the arithmetic of the day. The injunction freezing the respondent's personal checking accounts is immediately lifted. The petitioners are responsible for all court costs associated with this filing. The judge stood and exited the bench, disappearing through the heavy wooden doors leading to his chambers. The court clerk gathered the files, refusing to make eye contact with my parents' lawyer. The hearing was officially over. The ambush had failed. I remained seated at the respondent table. I did not cheer. I did not turn around to gloat at the people who had spent my entire life taxing my achievements to fund their favored son's failures. I simply reached down, picked up my leather work tote, and waited for Sylvia to secure her briefcase. The transaction was complete. My family had demanded a strict accounting of my worth. I had provided it. I had shown them that my independence was not an unmanaged pool of capital waiting to be harvested. It was a calculated, fortified structure that they would never under any circumstances be allowed to enter again. The math was clean, the ledger was balanced, and the only task remaining was to walk out of the courthouse and leave them to settle their own debts. Sylvia Reed snapped the brass latches of her briefcase closed. The sharp, metallic sound echoed through the emptying chamber, signaling the end of the transaction. I stood up and smoothed the lapels of my charcoal blazer. We did not linger at the respondent table to celebrate. In the actuarial field, you do not gloat when a risk model functions correctly. You simply file the report and move on to the next objective. We walked down the center aisle side by side, pushing open the heavy oak doors and stepping back into the marble corridor. The hallway outside courtroom 4 felt significantly colder than it had an hour prior. The false warmth of my parents' anticipated victory had vanished, replaced by the freezing reality of a structural collapse. They were clustered near the elevator banks. The flashy litigator they had hired was already creating physical distance between himself and his former clients. He was snapping his slim leather folder shut and adjusting his silk tie, his posture radiating professional detachment. I could hear the tense, clipped exchange of their conversation as we approached. Thomas was red in the face, his voice a harsh, raspy whisper. He was demanding an immediate appeal. He insisted the lawyer draft an injunction to freeze the corporate trust and force a secondary medical evaluation. The litigator shook his head, offering a tight, unsympathetic smile. He explained with brutal clarity that you cannot appeal the existence of an independent fiduciary entity. He reminded Thomas that the petition was dismissed with prejudice, meaning the legal avenue was permanently walled off. Then the lawyer casually mentioned that his final invoice for the morning appearance would be processed and mailed by the end of the business week. He turned on his heel and walked toward the stairwell, leaving my father holding the invisible weight of a devastating bill. Diane watched the lawyer walk away. The pious maternal sorrow she had performed for the judge evaporated. The mask shattered, leaving only raw, unvarnished panic. She turned and saw me walking toward the elevators. She stepped directly into my path, but this time there was no performative gentle touch. Her hands were trembling. Her face was pale and drawn tight with the sudden terrifying realization that her safety net was gone. "You have to undo this, Bernice," she said, her voice shrill and urgent. "You need to call that lawyer of yours right now and dissolve this trust. We have financial obligations. Landon already signed the work order for the kitchen contractors. We promised them a deposit by Friday. You cannot just lock up the money and walk away." She was no longer pretending I was a brain-injured victim. She was speaking to me as the competent, high-earning professional she had always known I was. The cognitive deficit lie was discarded the moment it stopped being useful. She was demanding I bail them out of a trap they had set for themselves. Landon stepped out from behind his mother. The charismatic swagger was entirely missing. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a ledge and realized gravity was real. "Bernice, come on," he pleaded, utilizing his practiced boyish charm. "Do not do this. I need that equity to float my new venture. I already put my apartment up as collateral for the business loan. If I do not get the cash infusion from the house, they are going to evict me. We are supposed to help each other." I stopped walking. I stood on the polished marble floor and looked at the three of them. I examined the people who shared my genetic code. I saw a father who tried to steal my autonomy to cover his own failures. I saw a brother who treated my life savings as his personal checking account. I saw a mother who weaponized neighborhood gossip to erase my dignity. They were waiting for me to yield. They expected the lifelong conditioning of guilt and obligation to override the empirical data of their betrayal. Diane took another step forward, her voice rising in the echoing corridor. "You have to fix this. We are your family." I looked at her with the calm, steady detachment of an analyst finalizing a catastrophic loss report. I did not raise my voice. I did not display a single trace of anger or resentment. "You aren't family," I said evenly, my words landing like heavy stones on the marble floor. "You were just a bad investment, and I've closed the account." I did not wait for her response. I stepped around her and pressed the call button for the elevator. The silver doors slid open immediately. Sylvia and I walked inside. I turned and faced the corridor as the doors began to close. Thomas was staring at the floor. Landon was staring at his phone, likely calculating how many days he had until the eviction notices arrived. Diane was staring at me, her mouth opening and closing without sound, unable to formulate a response to a boundary she could not manipulate. The elevator doors sealed shut, cutting off their view and taking me down to the lobby. I pushed through the glass exit doors of the courthouse and stepped out into the crisp Missouri air. The pale gray sky felt vast and open. I inhaled deeply, filling my lungs with the sharp autumn wind. The heavy, suffocating pressure I had carried since childhood dissolved. The physical sensation of true, unmitigated freedom is difficult to quantify, but in that moment, it felt like a perfectly balanced equation. I walked to my sedan, unlocked the doors, and drove back to the quiet cul-de-sac. The narrative of the Ainsworth family shifted dramatically over the next 6 months. The data followed a predictable downward trajectory once my subsidized income was removed from their ledger. The expensive litigator did not offer payment plans. He secured a lien against my parents' remaining assets to satisfy his exorbitant fees. Simultaneously, the contractor Landon had hired to demolish my kitchen demanded the 20% penalty fee outlined in the breached contract. Thomas and Diane were forced to withdraw the remaining balance of their retirement funds to cover the overlapping debts. Without my reliable financial bailouts, the math simply did not sustain their lifestyle. They could no longer afford the property taxes and maintenance on their large suburban home. 4 months after the probate hearing, they listed the house on the market. They downsized to a small 2-bedroom condominium in a less prestigious zip code. Landon met a similar statistical fate. His boutique fitness venture collapsed before it ever opened, yielding zero revenue. The creditors seized his apartment collateral and initiated formal eviction proceedings. With nowhere else to go, the favored, charismatic son packed his belongings into a rented van and moved into the spare bedroom of my parents' new cramped condominium. They were finally forced to live exclusively with the consequences of their own choices. They had built a toxic, dependent ecosystem, and now they were trapped inside it, together functioning in a closed economic loop that I would never fund again. My own trajectory moved in the opposite direction. The clarity and focus I regained after severing the familial liability translated directly into my professional output. 2 months after the court date, the managing partners at my actuarial firm called me into the executive boardroom. They cited my flawless execution of a highly complex municipal risk model and promoted me to the position of senior risk director. My salary increased by 40%. I did not use the new income to upgrade my lifestyle. I did not buy a luxury vehicle or a larger property. I directed the surplus capital straight into the Ainsworth Preservation Trust. The corporate fiduciary in Kansas City sent me quarterly statements printed on thick cream-colored paper, confirming the steady, uninterrupted growth of my portfolio. The structure held perfectly. Spring arrived in the show-me state, bringing heavy rains that washed the residual salt and grime from the streets. On a quiet Saturday morning, I woke up early and walked into my kitchen. The walls were intact. The sightlines were exactly as I preferred them. There was no custom island interrupting the flow of the room. I brewed a pot of dark roast coffee and poured a cup into a ceramic mug I had purchased for myself. I opened the front door and stepped out onto my porch. The air smelled of wet earth and blooming dogwood trees. The neighborhood was silent. Mrs. Higgins was tending to her rose bushes across the street. She did not offer me a pitying wave. The smear campaign had died the moment my parents packed their moving boxes and left the suburb in disgrace. The truth always outlasts a loud lie. I sat in the heavy wooden rocking chair on my porch, taking a slow sip of my coffee. I rested my left hand on the armrest. The fracture had healed seamlessly, leaving the bone stronger at the point of the break. I watched the morning light spill across the green lawn of the home I owned free and clear. I thought about the heavy leather briefcase my father used to carry and the fabricated medical charts my mother tried to weaponize. They felt like distant abstract variables from a risk model I had already solved. Welcome to the end of the equation. If you are watching this and you recognize the quiet, draining exhaustion of being treated like a utility instead of a human being, I want you to remember this story. Dignity is not found in winning a screaming match at a dining room table. Dignity is not found in convincing greedy people to suddenly develop a conscience. Dignity is found in recognizing your own value and building a fortress around it. It is found in quietly, methodically ensuring that the people who view you as a resource can never access your ledger again. You do not owe your life savings to a family that refuses to save themselves. You do not owe your sanity to a mother who uses your pain as a stage for her own performance. You only owe yourself the security of a well-fortified boundary. Protect your peace. Secure your assets. Let them calculate their own losses. Thank you for spending your time with Still Drama Stories today. I hope this narrative brought you the clarity you needed to balance your own ledgers. Drop a comment below and tell me how you protect your peace in difficult family situations. I read every single one. Remember to hit the subscribe button so we can keep sharing these quiet victories. Until next time, stay grounded, stay secure, and always keep the math in your favor. We all hold a quiet, idealized picture in our minds of what a family should look like. In the American cultural imagination, the family is the ultimate safety net, a sanctuary of unconditional love, a foundation built on traditional values, and a launching pad from which children step confidently into their own autonomy. But what happens when that sanctuary is quietly hollowed out from the inside? What happens when the foundational values of love and protection are twisted into tools of control? The story of Bernice Ainsworth is far more than a legal thriller about an actuary outsmarting her predatory parents. Beneath the irrevocable trusts and the dramatic courtroom dismissal lies a profound, heartbreaking autopsy of modern parenting. Through the collapse of the Ainsworth family, we are forced to confront uncomfortable truths about how we raise our children, how we define fairness, and what it truly means to guide a life into adulthood. The first and perhaps most devastating lesson from the Ainsworth household is the hidden danger of the golden child syndrome. In many families, there is an instinctive urge to protect children from pain. For Landon Bernice's older brother, this protection morphed into a lifelong shield against reality. His parents constantly rescued him from the consequences of his own irresponsibility, believing they were demonstrating deep parental love. But true emotional awareness in parenting requires us to understand that constantly saving a child is not an act of love, it is an act of sabotage. By repeatedly absorbing Landon's failures, his parents did not teach him how to walk. They taught him that someone else would always carry his weight. He became a man in his 30s who possessed the arrogant confidence of a successful adult, but the emotional and financial maturity of a toddler. Conversely, this toxic dynamic created a crushing burden for Bernice. When parents mistakenly equate a child's quiet competence with a lack of need, they often turn their most capable child into a utility. Bernice was not seen as a daughter who deserved praise. She was viewed as a built-in insurance policy for her brother's mistakes. This fundamental unfairness destroys the natural bond between siblings. Honest traditional family education requires that parents offer every child an equal opportunity to grow based on their own merits rather than forcing the strong to perpetually subsidize the weak. This brings us to the core of personal responsibility, a value deeply ingrained in the American ethos. American culture fiercely champions individual autonomy and self-reliance. Yet when Landon accumulated $14,000 in credit card debt to fund a vanity project, his parents did not use it as a teaching moment. Instead, they were willing to drain their own retirement funds and ultimately forced Bernice to quietly pay the debt just to maintain the illusion of Landon's success. As parents, the most agonizing yet necessary task is finding the courage to let your child fall. Teaching financial and personal responsibility means allowing a child to stand in the wreckage of their own poor decisions and say, "I love you, but this is yours to fix." Every financial decision carries risk and consequence. When we rob our children of the chance to face those consequences, we strip them of the very experiences they need to survive the unforgiving realities of the world. Landon was never taught to navigate a storm, and as a result, he was ultimately washed away by one. Furthermore, the Ainsworth story shines a glaring light on the absolute necessity of respecting a child's boundaries and autonomy. There is a dangerous unspoken mindset that sometimes creeps into traditional family structures, the idea that children are an extension of the parent's property, a long-term investment, or a retirement plan. Bernice's achievements, her prestigious career as an actuary, her $120,000 salary, the home she paid off entirely on her own, should have been the ultimate testament to successful parenting. Her parents should have looked at her quiet, stable life with immense, overwhelming pride. Instead, they looked at her home and saw a bridge loan. They looked at her salary and saw unallocated capital. They viewed their daughter not as an independent human being, but as a resource waiting to be harvested. Healthy parenting means recognizing the precise moment your child stops being a dependent and becomes an equal. As children mature, a parent's role must consciously evolve from one of active control to one of steady emotional support. Attempting to manipulate a child's life, dictating their finances, or in the darkest of cases, legally attempting to strip them of their autonomy is the ultimate betrayal of the parental mandate. We must critically redefine what we mean when we invoke traditional family values. In toxic environments, the phrase "we are family" is frequently weaponized. It becomes a tool of emotional blackmail used to justify boundary violations and demand unreasonable sacrifices. Diane and Thomas Ainsworth tried to use the sacred concept of family to legitimize outright theft. True traditional family culture is not a transactional contract where children must sacrifice their own futures, their peace of mind, or their hard-earned security to appease the endless demands of their parents. A genuinely healthy family structure is rooted in mutual respect, radical honesty, and unconditional love. It is a place where a child's independence is celebrated as the ultimate goal, not perceived as a threat to parental authority. Parents cannot demand loyalty and filial piety through manipulation. The future of any child depends heavily on whether they are taught through their parents' actions, how to respect themselves, and how to set boundaries that protect their own dignity. Stories like Bernice's hold up a mirror to the quiet, often unseen dynamics operating behind closed doors in neighborhoods everywhere. They ask us to evaluate the legacy we are leaving for the next generation. If you find yourself reflecting on your own family dynamics, or if you are passionate about exploring narratives that challenge our understanding of human connections and personal boundaries, I highly encourage you to follow and subscribe to Still Drama Stories. We are dedicated to bringing you stories that do more than just entertain. They provoke thought, inspire courage, and sometimes they help us heal. In the end, we must ask ourselves what we are truly building when we raise a family. You can construct a house with bricks, mortar, and legal deeds, but a home is built entirely on the quiet daily choices of how we choose to see one another. When you look at your own children, what do you see? Do you see a fragile, unfolding life that you are privileged to guide into independence? Or do you see a reflection of your own needs, a resource waiting to be tapped? The answer to that question is rarely spoken aloud. Instead, it is whispered in the small, seemingly insignificant moments of today. But make no mistake, those quiet whispers will eventually echo into the loud, undeniable realities of tomorrow, leaving behind either a legacy of unbreakable trust or a ledger of debts that can never truly be paid.